Before Dutch van der Linde became a legend, before the speeches and the wanted posters, there was a quieter figure riding beside him, Hosea Matthews. A conman, a thief, an outlaw in the truest sense, but also the hidden center of a story that stretches from the rough 1870s frontier to the dying years of the Old West. This is not just the story of Dutch's dream. It is the story of the man who taught him how to dream in the first place. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang was never just a collection of criminals. It was a philosophy in motion, a roaming argument against a civilization that seemed built on exploitation and hypocrisy. The world was changing, railroads and banks carving up the land, the old ways were dying. And two drifting conmen met on a dusty road, each trying to rob the other. Out of that moment of ironic misunderstanding came a partnership that would shape Arthur's first ride, John's last stand, and everything in between. Hosea's life forms the thread that runs through the entire van der Linde saga, from the first small-time cons of the late 1870s to the grand delusions of Saint Denis and the bleak aftermath in the early 1900s. He is there when Dutch is still hungry and idealistic, when Arthur is a half-wild teenager desperate for direction, when John is taken in as another lost soul needing a family more than a score. Through Blackwater, Coulter, Valentine, Rhodes, and Shady Bell, Hosea stands at Dutch's shoulder, the strategist and skeptic behind the speeches. In that sense, the gang becomes a microcosm of America itself, born from rebellion and high-minded rhetoric, talking about freedom and fairness, then slowly warped by greed, violence, and the relentless march of civilization. Dutch is the voice, Arthur is the hands, John is the legacy. Hosea is the lens. Through him, the transformation is clearest, the shift from robbing the rich and corrupt to spilling blood for plans that no longer make sense. From dreams of a better world to delusions that can only end in betrayal. This is a story of idealism versus reality, of freedom versus the fences and rail lines closing in, of loyalty tested against the creeping shadow of paranoia. Hosea believes in the dream, yet constantly measures its cost. He pushes for escape long before Dutch rants about Tahiti, talks of leaving America entirely while there is still time. But what happens when the man who built the dream starts to lose control of the man who sells it? Players know the image of Hosea dying on the steps of the Saint Denis Bank, a single shot that shatters the gang's fragile balance. What remains less visible is how he lived, what he believed, and how his gradual failure to rein in Dutch quietly doomed the gang years before the Pinkertons closed in. To understand that, the story must return to the very beginning, to a cold road in the 1870s, and to two men reaching for the same gun and the same wallet. Two hands on one pistol. Two voices demanding the same wallet. The story of Hosea Matthews begins not with a gunfight, but with a con, and a meeting that changes the West forever. This is the complete story of Hosea Matthews. From his shadowy early life as a drifting swindler, through his first crimes and confidence tricks, through the founding of the van der Linde gang with Dutch, through Arthur and John's recruitment, through Blackwater, Coulter, Valentine, Rhodes, and Saint Denis, all the way to his final breath, and the echoes that still haunt Red Dead Redemption. From its humble beginnings to its bloody conclusion, Hosea's life will be followed to the very end. The narrative will move chronologically, but time is only the surface. The true spine of this saga is Hosea's inner world, his doubts about Dutch's philosophy, his hopes for freedom and family, his careful calculations as civilization closes in. Every camp, every heist, every argument around a fire will be framed through what Hosea sees, what he fears, and what he tries in vain to prevent. This is, in the truest sense, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an outlaw who can read the future but cannot escape it. The journey begins with those early cons and robberies, the traveling snake oil pitches, the rigged card games, the small-town auction scams that show Hosea's preference for brains over bloodshed. It follows the moment he and Dutch stop trying to rob each other and decide to build something together. A roaming gang that will be the living embodiment of their shared belief that the world is rigged, that the old ways were dying, and that only outlaws could be truly free. From there, the story will track the gang's growth. Arthur found as a young thief and turned into a son, John brought in as another lost soul in need of purpose. It will linger on the early years when Dutch's rhetoric still sounds idealistic, when Hosea still believes that careful planning and targeted robberies can keep their family alive on the margins of a changing world. Then the focus will narrow on the great turning points, the disaster at Blackwater that shatters their illusion of control, the frozen desperation of Coulter, the rough and tumble days in Valentine where Hosea runs cons instead of gunfights, the poisonous elegance of Rhodes, where his schemes with the Greys and Braithwaites expose the gang to deeper corruption, and finally the glittering trap of Saint Denis, where Hosea's warnings go unheeded, and one shot in a bank lobby tears out the gang's conscience. Told as a dramatic, reflective, cinematic retelling, this will treat Dutch's gang as a tragic myth, yet ground every beat in game lore, dialogue, and implied backstory. Because to understand how the van der Linde dream dies, the story must first show how Hosea tried to save it, and why he failed. To understand why Hosea dies as the gang's conscience, the story has to go back before Dutch, before the speeches and the campfires, to a drifting man whose life had already been a long lesson in consequence. The games only sketch this period in fragments, in offhand remarks and tired sighs, but those fragments reveal a great deal. By the time of 1899, Hosea is in his late 50s, carrying himself with the weary certainty of someone who has seen the world change several times over. He talks about past mistakes with the precision of a man who has counted every one, and his easy familiarity with scams, fences, and backwater towns suggests decades of practice. From the very beginning, Hosea's voice sounds like a ledger being read aloud, profits and losses, victories and regrets, all carefully weighed. His manner hints at an upbringing steeped in hardship and instability. Hosea moves from camp to camp with no complaint, sleeps under wagons, and treats sudden flight as a familiar inconvenience rather than a crisis. That comfort with drifting speaks to a childhood where nothing stayed in one place for long, where family was temporary and roofs were optional. In the truest sense, he is the living embodiment of survival by wit rather than by roots. The skills that define him later were not learned in books. They were earned in alleys, river ports, and ramshackle frontier towns. One can hear it when he talks about old riverboats and crooked card tables, about sheriffs who could be charmed and merchants who could be bled dry. Hosea's early criminal life was almost certainly built on small time theft and confidence tricks, picking pockets in crowded markets, selling fake medicines to desperate farmers, playing a dozen roles in a single afternoon just to eat. Over time, that petty thievery hardened into a philosophy. Hosea learned to read a mark's eyes before reaching for a wallet, to measure fear and greed and pride the way other men measured distance with a rifle. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and guns were getting louder, but Hosea understood that a quiet lie could still open doors that dynamite would only bury. His later disdain for pointless violence is no late conversion. It is the product of a lifetime spent proving that brains beat bullets more often than not. Yet beneath the charm and calculation, there is a persistent loneliness. Hosea drifts from con to con, town to town, mastering every angle but never finding a cause worth more than the next payday. He is an outlaw without a banner, a lost soul who has survived everything except his own restlessness. That emptiness is what makes the moment he meets Dutch so dangerous. Because for the first time, Hosea will see a chance to turn all his skills into something greater than survival. The question is, what happens when a man built on pragmatism throws his lot in with a dreamer? The moment arrives in a cheap room on a quiet night, without witnesses and without ceremony. From its humble beginnings, this is where a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, takes its first real shape. Two strangers, one mark, and a single lamp burning low in a small-town hotel around 1877. Hosea moves first. He has watched the target all evening, a traveling businessman too proud of his watch and too loose with his whiskey. The hallway smells of stale smoke and floor polish as Hosea slips along the faded carpet, every footstep placed with the care of a man who has lived too long to trust luck. The door gives under his practiced hand. The room is dim, the mark snoring, the world outside already fading into rain and darkness. Then he sees it. A shadow that is not his. A figure already standing over the half-open valise, one hand on the money, the other hovering near a holster. For a heartbeat, time freezes. Two outlaws, both mid-robbery, both caught in the act of stealing what the other has already stolen. The irony hangs in the air, sharp as gunpowder. Guns move halfway from leather, eyes lock. Each man measures the distance, the angle, the weight of the other's decision. This is the very beginning of something that could end in blood on the floorboards. Dutch van der Linde, younger but already theatrical, smiles first. It is not a friendly smile. It is a test, a performance, a dare. Dutch speaks in big words for a small room, dressing up the situation in talk of opportunity and fate, calling their collision a sign from the universe rather than a simple mistake. Hosea listens, dry amusement flickering behind his eyes, quietly poking holes in Dutch's philosophy even as he recognizes its power. Where Dutch is heat, Hosea is cool. Where Dutch reaches for grand speeches about freedom and civilization, Hosea is already calculating exits, splits, and odds. The tension breaks, not with a gunshot, but with laughter. Two men who have spent their lives waiting for betrayal suddenly see something else in front of them. A mirror, a fellow professional, a lost soul who refuses to bow to the world that is closing in. In the truest sense, they are enemies for exactly 1 minute, and then they are something far more dangerous. They wake the mark together, spin a story together, empty his pockets together. By the time the man is trussed, robbed, and left to sleep off his humiliation, the money has already been divided. One bottle becomes 2 glasses. One night becomes a long conversation about what this world is, what it could be, and how the old ways were dying under the boot of railroads and bankers. By sunrise, the decision is made. They will ride together. Dutch brings the grand vision, Hosea brings the method, and between them a gang will grow that claims to be the living embodiment of resistance to a dying frontier. What began as a failed robbery becomes a partnership that will pull in Arthur, John, and so many others, and the next chapter of their story will show how that partnership turns from idealistic dream into inevitable tragedy. From that botched first robbery, the partnership hardens into a rhythm, and for a few wandering years it is just Dutch and Hosea against the world. They drift from town to town, from its humble beginnings in backwater settlements to rough frontier crossroads, robbing small banks, holding up stagecoaches, running cons on cattle barons and railroad men who underestimate 2 well-dressed strangers. Dutch goes in loud, all charm and thunder. Hosea hangs back, watching doors, counting guns, measuring exits. It becomes almost theatrical. Dutch strides through a bank lobby, coat flared, preaching about freedom and corruption while terrified clerks fumble at safes. Hosea is already behind the counter, having slipped in as a harmless customer an hour earlier, knowing exactly which drawer holds the keys. When Dutch stops a coach with a flourish and a speech about reclaiming what civilization stole, Hosea is the quiet voice at his shoulder, reminding him how long until the next patrol rides this road. Their temperaments lock into place as perfect opposites, and that contrast is the foundation of everything that follows. Dutch chases big gestures, big scores, big speeches about a story of resistance and destiny. Hosea scouts the ground the night before, maps the town in his head, and insists on a second horse hidden behind the ridge. Dutch dreams of grand heists that will change their lives. Hosea calculates how many bullets the guards actually carry and how quickly the law can telegraph for help. One man reaches for legend, the other quietly keeps them alive. But beneath the robberies, something deeper is forming. Nights around campfires, with the loot counted and the danger past, the talk turns from jobs to philosophy. Dutch rails against the government, the banks, the creeping march of civilization. Hosea, more reflective, wonders what will be left when the old ways were dying and the world was changing faster than men like them can ride. They debate politics, argue about the future of America, and convince each other in the truest sense that they are not common thieves at all. Hosea's influence on Dutch's self-image is subtle but decisive. It is Hosea who sharpens the idea that they rob from the rich and the corrupt, that their crimes are aimed upward, not downward. It is Hosea who starts talking about building a family of misfits rather than a simple gang, about taking in every lost soul the world discards. Dutch seizes on that language, turns it into doctrine, and soon he is the living embodiment of a roaming, idealistic brotherhood, even as the work still comes down to guns and gold. Before Arthur, before John, before Blackwater or St. Denis, there is only this: 2 men who believe they understand each other completely. Partners in crime who become brothers in purpose. Their shared dream of freedom and family feels unbreakable. Yet in that certainty, the seeds of delusion are already planted, waiting for the day more people join, the stakes rise. And one friend begins to drift beyond the other's reach. That dream needs words. It needs a banner to march under. In the quiet years after the very beginning, Dutch's anger and Hosea's cunning harden into something larger than two men chasing quick scores. They begin to call it a philosophy, a story of freedom and family on the edge of a dying frontier. Dutch gives it fire. Around campfires and in smoky saloons, his rhetoric crystallizes into set pieces he can deliver on command. He rails against government agents, against banks that own the land, against railroads that carve the world into metal lines and timetables. Civilization, in his telling, is a cage built by cowards and accountants. Out here, beyond the tracks, an outlaw can be the living embodiment of true freedom. No masters, no bosses, only the gang and the open horizon. But the raw ore of that anger needs shaping. That is Hosea's work. Less romantic, more precise, he trims Dutch's wild speeches into something repeatable, persuasive, almost noble. Dutch rages that the world was changing. Hosea turns that into a narrative about the old ways were dying and someone needing to stand up for them. Dutch curses the banks. Hosea suggests they rob the right banks, the ones that squeeze farmers and small towns, so every heist can be told as an act of rough justice. Together, they transform scattered frustrations into doctrine. New recruits do not simply join a gang. They enter a family and, in the truest sense, a social experiment. Dutch and Hosea promise food for the hungry, guns for the powerless, protection for every lost soul the law has failed. In return, there is loyalty, shared risk, and acceptance of Dutch's word as final. A frightened girl fleeing abuse, a drifter beaten by lawmen, a boy caught stealing apples. Each is folded into this traveling community and told they are worth something at last. Yet from its humble beginnings, the contradictions are obvious to anyone willing to look closely. They preach fairness while emptying safes. They condemn the railroad tycoons for bleeding the frontier dry, then hold up trains at gunpoint. They insist they are better than the lawmen who brutalize the poor, yet they leave bodies in ditches when plans go wrong. Is it justice, or just a prettier story wrapped around greed and survival? Hosea feels that tension early. He believes in the family, not the fantasy. Around the fire, he repeats Dutch's lines with conviction, because those dreams keep frightened people brave and keep quarrelsome outlaws moving in the same direction. In private, though, he prods Dutch toward quieter jobs, smarter cons, fewer bullets. Tahiti and Australia are, to him, metaphors for escape, not literal destinations. He senses that the philosophy is both shield and sword, both ideal and delusion. And as the gang grows, as Arthur and then John arrive, Hosea begins to wonder how long this fragile balance between belief and blood can truly hold before the story consumes the family it was meant to protect. Hosea understands that balance demands boundaries. From the very beginning, long before Blackwater and Saint Denis, he draws his own in quiet, deliberate lines. He is not a hidden saint wandering through a den of wolves. He is a career criminal, a practiced conman, an outlaw who has stolen, lied, and run grifts across a changing world. But in the truest sense, he has a code. For Hosea, the philosophy is simple: brains before blood. Killing is a failure, not a badge of honor. He prefers the long game, the clever swindle, the robbery where the victim walks away angry and humiliated but still breathing. He refuses to hurt people just to make a point, refuses slaughter as spectacle. The old ways were dying, and he knows that mindless violence only gives civilization an excuse to crush what little freedom remains. That code shapes every job he is willing to bless. When Dutch dreams of grand gestures, Hosea reaches for the ledger and the timetable, asking who actually pays the price. Banks, railroads, wealthy ranchers, corrupt sheriffs, rival gangs, those are acceptable targets. The living embodiment of the rigged system Dutch rails against. Innocent townsfolk, frightened clerks, children in the street, those are not. So he plans routes that avoid main roads, chooses nights when saloons are full and sidewalks are empty, and drills the gang on getting in and out before bullets start flying. Hosea becomes, almost by accident, the gang's conscience. Dutch gives the speeches, but Hosea decides which dreams become action. When Dutch's schemes grow too violent or grandiose, Hosea is the one who leans back, eyes narrowed, and asks the question no one else dares. Is this about survival or pride? Again and again, he argues for smaller, smarter scores instead of reckless statements meant to prove a point to a world that is not listening. That pattern echoes through the years and foreshadows the tragedy to come. In Valentine, it is Hosea who turns a simple horse auction into a quiet fortune, spinning a fake sale and a staged dispute rather than a bloody robbery. No gunfights in the mud, no bodies in the street, just words, performance, and a clean getaway. In Rhodes, he plays the Braithwaites and Greys against each other, nudging Dutch toward manipulation and away from open war, hoping that clever lies can replace open graves. Yet the world was changing faster than his caution could contain. As Pinkerton pressure mounts, as railroads spread and telegraphs shrink distances, Hosea's careful, moral approach begins to feel, to Dutch, like hesitation. Dutch needs spectacle to prove his philosophy still matters. Hosea wants survival for the family they built from its humble beginnings. That tension between freedom and civilization, between quiet profit and violent theater, will only grow. And soon, the day will come when Dutch stops listening to the one man who ever told him no. That tension does not stay abstract for long. It takes shape in the faces around the fire, in the way Dutch and Hosea begin gathering the broken and the angry, turning a partnership of two into something larger, messier, and far more dangerous, a family of outlaws. Dutch falls into a pattern that will define him. He plays the savior. Time and again, he and Hosea ride into some forgotten town or mining camp and ride out with another lost soul, runaway kids beaten by fathers or overseers, orphans sleeping in alleys, abused ranch hands who dared to ask for wages, desperate drifters staring down a winter with no work and no food. Dutch offers them firelight, a bedroll, and a share in the take, dressing simple survival in the language of freedom and philosophy. Hosea watches all of this with sharper eyes. To Dutch, every recruit is a believer in the making. To Hosea, every recruit is a risk to be weighed. He does not just look for toughness or a quick trigger. He studies posture, listens to silences, tests for loyalty and intelligence. Can this one keep a secret? Will that one panic under pressure? How will this temper mix with Bill's, or this pride with Dutch's ego? In the very beginning, Hosea is less a recruiter and more a quiet architect, arranging personalities so the whole camp does not tear itself apart. What emerges from its humble beginnings is not merely a gang, but, in the truest sense, a rough household on the move. Meals are shared from one pot, not parceled out as wages. Stories are traded across the fire, Dutch quoting poetry and railing against civilization, Hosea telling dry, precise tales of cons gone wrong and cons gone right. Birthdays are remembered with little gifts, a new book for Arthur, a ribbon for some young girl who barely remembers her real parents. Dutch and Hosea present themselves not as bosses, but as uncles, as fathers, the living embodiment of the promise that no one under their banner will ever be alone again. For a time, it works. The camp functions almost as a roaming commune, a story of cooperation in a world that insists only on hierarchy and punishment. Everyone works, hunting, guarding, scouting, cooking, everyone eats, from Dutch down to the newest child taken in from the cold. Everyone believes they are part of something bigger than robbery, that each train and bank is another blow struck for the dying old ways and against the encroaching world of railroads and Pinkertons. But that closeness carries a shadow. The deeper the bonds, the sharper the edge of betrayal. When leaders are fathers, disobedience becomes treason, doubt becomes sacrilege. The gang's greatest strength, the fierce, almost religious loyalty it inspires, begins to harden into something brittle. What happens when the father loses his way? What happens when the family's dreams curdle into delusions? Those questions are already hanging over the fire, even if no one dares to speak them yet. And the day is coming when the first real fracture will prove that this family can bleed. That fracture does not begin with a gunshot or a betrayal. It begins with a boy, a half-wild teenager whose arrival quietly turns this band of dreamers into a family in the truest sense. Arthur Morgan's story is a story of abandonment before it is a story of outlaw glory. From its humble beginnings, his life is marked by absence and anger. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a petty criminal drifting through a world that has no patience for small-time thieves. Arrests, disappearances, broken promises. These are Arthur's childhood. When Lyle is finally taken by the law for good and dies in prison, the boy is left with no mother, no money, and no map. Only a simmering rage at civilization and a head start on crime. By his early teens, Arthur is already robbing to eat, stealing horses, waving a gun he barely understands how to use. He is dangerous, but mostly to himself. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and there is this angry kid on the edge of it all, convinced that the only rule is take or be taken. He is not yet an outlaw with a code. He is a lost soul, alone on the road. That is where Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews find him. Two seasoned outlaws, already partners, already building their own philosophy of freedom and resistance, ride up on a scrawny teenager trying to hold them at gunpoint. It is almost funny, two master thieves being robbed by a boy who can barely keep his hands from shaking. Almost. Dutch sees something immediately. Not just a thief, not just another recruit, but a blank slate. Here is his chance to prove that his ideals are more than words shouted around a campfire. If a broken, angry boy can be turned into a principled outlaw with a cause, then Dutch's philosophy is vindicated. He takes Arthur under his wing, teaches him to read, to argue, to see their crimes as part of a grander story of resistance against a rigged world. Hosea's gaze is different, quieter, more practical. He looks at Arthur and does not see a symbol. He sees a kid who will be dead before 20 if someone does not teach him patience, discipline, and the art of thinking 3 moves ahead. Hosea shows him how to hunt, how to scout a town, how to walk away from a bad job. Where Dutch gives him dreams, Hosea gives him habits. Together, they do something neither has done before. They become fathers. Arthur's arrival marks the very beginning of the van der Linde gang as a true family, not just a partnership. Over time, he grows into the living embodiment of their shared ideals and their contradictions, the emotional anchor around which everyone else orbits. And once a family has a son, what happens when another one shows up at the door? The answer, of course, is that the first son is already being pulled in 2 directions. From its humble beginnings as a partnership of 2 outlaws, the van der Linde gang becomes, in the truest sense, a story of 2 fathers shaping one impressionable boy. Dutch gives Arthur a philosophy. Hosea gives him a toolkit. Between them, they forge not just a gunman, but a believer, someone whose entire identity hangs on the idea that this ragged camp is more than crime. It is family, purpose, even salvation. Dutch's lessons come wrapped in speeches. Around the fire, on horseback, before a job, he paints the world in grand colors. Civilization is corrupt, the rich are parasites, freedom is worth any blood price. Arthur learns to echo those words until they sound like his own. He rides into Valentine and Rhodes not as a common thief, but as a soldier in a noble war against a rigged system. When the gang robs a train, or a bank, or a rich oil man, Dutch tells him their violence has meaning. Arthur believes him. There is a pattern. Dutch speaks, Arthur absorbs, and the gang moves. We are not criminals, Dutch insists. We are outlaws in the truest sense. Arthur repeats that to others, even when the line between the two grows thin. He becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's idealistic dreams and growing delusions, proof that a lost soul can be remade by the right words and the right cause. At least that is what Dutch needs to see. Hosea's influence is quieter and far more practical. By the campfire or on a fishing trip, he teaches Arthur how to plan a job so no one dies, how to read a mark in Valentine's saloon, how to walk away when a score smells wrong. The Rhodes cons, the auction scams, the preference for brains over bullets, these are Hosea's fingerprints. He reminds Arthur that survival is its own kind of freedom, that a dead idealist helps no one. Most importantly, Hosea teaches Arthur to question, to look past appearances, to listen for the tremor in Dutch's voice when a plan is more about pride than necessity. In late-night talks, he hints that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that Dutch's refusal to bend might break them all. Arthur hears him. He just does not yet know what to do with that doubt. Together, Dutch and Hosea create a validation loop that feels unbreakable. Dutch points to Arthur as proof his philosophy can rescue men from nothing and turn them into something. Hosea points to Arthur as proof that careful guidance can keep that philosophy from tipping into madness. Arthur, in turn, clings to both, convinced these men gave him a life worth living, a family when he had none. That depth of belief is beautiful. It is also fatal, because when Dutch's mask slips and Hosea can no longer pull him back from the edge, Arthur will not simply lose a leader and a mentor. He will lose the two fathers who made him, and with them, the story he tells himself about who he is. And into that fracture, another son will step, carrying his own doubts and his own destiny. Another stray steps into the fire, and this one will change everything. If Arthur is the dutiful son of Dutch's philosophy, then John Marston arrives as its question mark, a story of loyalty and doubt, of family offered and family refused. From the very beginning, John's life is a catalogue of abandonment. Born to a Scottish outlaw and a prostitute who died when he was 8, he is handed off to the state, shuffled through orphanages and reform schools that promise salvation but deliver bruises. He runs, is dragged back, runs again. The institutions of civilization that claim to protect children instead teach him a simpler lesson: trust no one. By his early teens, he is wandering the frontier, stealing bread, lifting coins, drifting from town to town. Hunger becomes a constant companion. Freedom, in the truest sense, means sleeping under the stars and wondering if the next morning will come at all. Eventually, desperation pushes him from petty theft into full outlaw life. He falls in with rustlers and drifters, half-gangs with no philosophy beyond the next bottle. There is no code, no higher dream, only cold nights and colder betrayals. When a botched robbery leaves him shot and alone in the wilderness, John is barely more than a boy, bleeding into the dirt, another lost soul the world is ready to forget. Then Dutch rides in and rewrites the script. Dutch finds John half dead, hauls him onto a horse, feeds him, tends his wounds, and offers the same speech that once captured Arthur: this gang is family, this camp is home, this life is resistance against a corrupt world where the old ways were dying. To a starving teenager, it sounds almost holy. Almost, because John is not Arthur. Where Arthur heard Dutch and believed, John listens and smirks. He owes Dutch his life, but debt is not devotion. He tests boundaries, talks back, pushes against the grand speeches with sarcasm and hard questions. If Arthur is the living embodiment of Dutch's idealistic dreams, John stands at the edge of the firelight, arms crossed, asking what happens when those dreams collide with reality. Hosea sees it immediately. Another damaged kid, another chance to do better than the world ever did, but also a spark that could burn the camp if mishandled. John's temper flares quick, his pride refuses to bend, and he bristles at the gang's unspoken emotional rules: unshakable loyalty to Dutch, reverence for the cause, silence about doubts. Hosea hunts with him, teaches him to read people, pulls him aside after outbursts, and quietly nudges him back into line. Yet he understands that John will never bow as easily as Arthur. So the Linde camp gains not just a second son, but a second center of gravity. Two boys raised under the same two fathers, hearing the same sermons about freedom and family, but walking diverging paths. One leans into belief, the other leans into skepticism, and in the years to come, that quiet difference will decide who clings to Dutch's delusions and who finally walks away. Because when the world was changing, Dutch needed followers. What he got were witnesses. And witnesses eventually tell a different story. Arthur and John grow up in the same fire, but they do not burn the same way. From its humble beginnings, their relationship is a story of brotherhood and rivalry, of shared bloodshed and quiet resentment, all unfolding under Dutch and Hosea's watchful eyes. From the very beginning, Arthur is the proven son. He comes in young, shaped by Dutch's philosophy, trained by Hosea's patience. He learns to read Dutch's books, to quote Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization, to believe that their outlaw family stands for something more than money. John arrives later, half feral, already a thief, already suspicious of grand ideas. Dutch and Hosea save him from a chain gang, but they also throw him into a hierarchy that Arthur has already filled. On the surface, there is camaraderie. They ride together, bleed together, tease each other around the campfire. Arthur pulls John out of trouble more than once, and John, in his own way, respects Arthur's skill. Yet beneath that, there is constant comparison. Arthur is reliable, dutiful, the living embodiment of Dutch's teachings. John disappears for months, questions orders, and comes back with scars and attitude. Dutch praises Arthur's loyalty. He scolds John's recklessness. Everyone hears the difference. Hosea hears it most of all. He becomes the quiet mediator, the man in the middle of two surrogate sons who cannot quite see that they are walking the same road. When Arthur fumes about John running off or failing to pull his weight, Hosea talks him down, reminding him of his own wild years, of the times Dutch had to drag him out of a saloon or a noose. When John bristles at Arthur's lectures, Hosea takes him aside and explains that Arthur's faith in Dutch is not arrogance, but a shield against a harsh world that keeps closing in. John never fully buys the ideology. He does the robberies, takes the bullets, survives the chaos, yet he rarely repeats Dutch's speeches with the same reverence. To John, Dutch's grand dreams sound beautiful, but distant. He senses that the old ways were dying, that civilization is not going to be stopped by a single gang hiding in the trees. Hosea notices this skepticism, and he does not crush it. He probes it, tests it, wonders where it will lead. Over time, Arthur and John become a living debate inside the camp. Arthur wants to believe their crimes are rebellion, that their raids on trains and banks are blows against a corrupt world. John suspects they are dressing up greed in poetry. One clings to dreams, the other fears delusions. Hosea stands between them, translating, softening, keeping the argument from tearing the family apart. And here lies the quiet tragedy. Hosea is the only one who can speak honestly to both. When that voice is silenced in Saint Denis, when Dutch loses his oldest friend, who will calm Arthur's anger or steady John's doubt? The answer will not be found in words. It will be written in gunfire. Gunfire may write the ending, but day to day the gang survives on quieter work. While Dutch thunders about freedom and destiny, Hosea is the one counting bullets, checking the horses, and making sure the stew pot is actually full. From its humble beginnings, this was never just a band of outlaws. It was a moving village, and Hosea Matthews was its quiet architect. Every camp the gang builds, from the frozen misery of Coulter to the soft heat of Clemens Point, bears his invisible signature. Dutch might point at a map and declare a direction, but Hosea chooses the exact hollow in the trees, the bend in the river, the ruined manor that can be turned into shelter. He looks for water, for cover, for escape routes that vanish into timber and fog. In a world where the old ways were dying and Pinkertons had trains and telegraphs, Hosea understood that survival depended on thinking 3 steps ahead. The layout is never random. Wagons form a crude wall, giving the women and children a semblance of privacy at the center. The horses are picketed where they can be cut loose in seconds, yet screened from distant eyes. Lookouts sit where a rifle can command the road, and where a lantern at night would be a death sentence. Even the campfire circle, the shared meals and late-night stories are placed so that everyone can see each other's faces and hear each other's moods. Comfort and security, family and defense, all woven together. But Hosea is not only arranging tents and rifles, he is arranging people. He walks the camp with a tin cup in hand, checking on Karen's drinking, on Bill's temper, on Javier's pride. He listens to Tilly's worries, to Pearson's complaints, to Abigail's fears for Jack. When Dutch's voice starts to rise, when Arthur's jaw tightens or John's sarcasm turns sharp, Hosea drifts between them, turning a looming explosion into a muttered argument that burns out over coffee. Who else could nudge Dutch away from a fight with his own surrogate sons and make it feel like Dutch's idea? Through this constant, almost invisible work, the gang becomes a system rather than a loose pack. Chores are assigned, hunting and guard duty rotate, and even in the chaos after Blackwater, there is a rhythm, wash days at the river, card games under the lanterns, traditions that make their outlaw life feel, in the truest sense, like a home. It is a story of routine and ritual, holding back the encroaching weight of civilization. Without that framework, Dutch's philosophy would hang in the air, all speeches and no shelter. Dreams need a place to sleep. The living embodiment of that truth is Hosea, turning grand ideals into coffee, canvas, and watch rotations. And when the camp begins to fray, when the system he built starts to crack, the tragedy of what follows becomes impossible to ignore. But Hosea's work did not end at coffee pots and watch rotations. Order at camp meant nothing without the right people sleeping around that fire, and from the very beginning, Hosea took it upon himself to decide who earned a bedroll and who got turned back to the dark. Dutch made the speeches. Hosea asked the questions. A new face would wander in, drawn by rumors of freedom and easy money, and Hosea would sit them down away from the noise, voice calm, eyes razor sharp. Where are you from? Who is looking for you? What do you really want? In those quiet interviews lay a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged from its humble beginnings out of broken men and women. He did not just listen to answers, he listened to the pauses. He watched the hands, the eyes, the way a supposed tough man flinched when Dutch mentioned Pinkertons or prison. Hosea was measuring desperation and honesty in equal parts, searching for that dangerous balance where a lost soul might be loyal, but not yet completely gone. Take Bill Williamson. When Hosea first saw him, Bill was drunk, angry, already half ruined by the army and whatever had happened after. Useful muscle, Hosea thought, but unstable, a powder keg in human form. In their talk, Bill bragged about killing, about standing his ground, about never backing down. Hosea heard something else, a man terrified of being laughed at, terrified of being left behind. He warned Dutch, "This one will fight for us, but one day he might fight us." Dutch, ever the optimist, saw only a soldier in need of a flag and waved him in. Javier Escuela was different. When they found him, guitar on his back, hunted for a killing in Mexico, he spoke about revolution and injustice with almost religious fire. Idealistic, romantic, loyal to an idea more than to himself. Hosea liked him, but he also knew that men who worship causes can be blinded by them. He asked Javier what he would do when their philosophy no longer matched the reality of survival. Javier smiled and promised eternal loyalty. Dutch believed him. Hosea filed away the doubt. Over the years, others came, sharp-eyed gamblers, quiet trackers, women who could shoot straighter than most men. Hosea favored those who could adapt, who could learn to think as well as shoot, who understood that in the truest sense the gang's real weapon was its mind. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and brute force alone would not hold back civilization. Yet time and again, there were moments when Hosea hesitated, and Dutch pushed forward, insisting that everyone deserved a chance under his banner. Each recruitment was a stitch in a patchwork quilt of broken pasts, Dutch's words threading through Hosea's judgment. And in those early choices, in those ignored warnings and hopeful acceptances, the first faint outlines of future betrayal were already being drawn, waiting for the right pressure to tear the whole thing apart. But while the gang's family was growing, the world around it was changing even faster. The story of the Van der Linde gang was never just a tale of campfires and shootouts. It unfolded against a continent being carved up by steel and wire, by railroads and telegraphs that turned wilderness into mapped, measured territory. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s, the gang had roamed a west that still felt open, where a clever conman and a fast horse could disappear over the next ridge. By the late 1890s, that world was vanishing. Rail lines cut through forests and across plains, bringing settlers, soldiers, and bankers in equal measure. Telegraph poles marched beside the tracks, each wire another thread binding distant towns to distant capitals. Cities such as Saint Denis rose from the mud as the living embodiment of industrial power, smoke and wealth stacked on top of poverty and control. Dutch saw all of this as an enemy. In his mind, trains were not just machines but symbols of a civilization that wanted to fence in freedom, to turn wild land and wild men into ledgers and laws. He raged about government agents and oil barons, about the betrayal of the frontier, about the old ways dying under the boots of progress. To him, every new rail spur was a noose tightening around the neck of the outlaw dream. Hosea read the same landscape differently. The world was changing, and in the truest sense he knew it could not be bullied back into the past. Railroads meant more trains to rob, yes, but also more patrols and timetables, more Pinkertons riding the same tracks. Telegraphs meant faster marks for cons in booming towns, but also faster messages between sheriffs, judges, and private detectives. Where Dutch saw a war to be won by sheer defiance, Hosea saw a tide that had to be navigated or it would drown them all. Their operations evolved in response, almost without the younger members noticing. Train robberies went from opportunistic ambushes to carefully timed strikes, studying schedules and cargo lists. Banks no longer held loose coin in back rooms, they had imported heavy safes. hired guards, and insured deposits. Each big score promised more money, but it also triggered faster, sharper responses. Pinkertons arrived by rail within days, sometimes hours, armed not only with guns, but with reports, witness statements, and a growing file on the Linde gang. Hosea felt the noose before most even saw the rope. Every forged signature, every bank ledger, every ticket stub was a thin paper trail that civilization could follow. He warned Dutch that their philosophy had to change, that disappearing into the hills was no longer as simple as burning a camp and riding at dawn. Dutch listened, nodded, and then planned the next grand gesture. The next attack on a world he refused to admit had already outgrown them. In that widening gap between Dutch's romantic vision and Hosea's hard realism, the first real fracture formed. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, and Hosea could already sense which side would win. The question was not whether the modern world would catch them. The question was how many in this outlaw family would be dragged down when Dutch finally chose pride over survival. That question was answered in Blackwater. For years, Dutch and Hosea had dreamed of one last job that would buy true freedom, not just another season on the run. Blackwater was Dutch's grand answer, a modern city on the edge of the Great Plains. A gleaming symbol that the world was changing and that civilization now rode in on steam and steel instead of horses. To Dutch, robbing its ferry was not just a score, it was a statement. The plan, on paper, was almost elegant. A heavily laden ferry bringing government and banking money into Blackwater's bustling port, a quick strike on the water, a clean escape before the Pinkertons or local law could organize. Dutch framed it as the living embodiment of their philosophy: strike the rich, hurt the system, then vanish over the horizon at last. Tahiti, Australia, some far-flung shore where the gang could finally live as a family without masks or wanted posters. Hosea heard the dream. He also heard the danger. From the very beginning, he saw the scale of the thing: the crowds, the armed guards, the telegraph wires humming with instant communication, the Pinkerton agents already prowling the streets. This was not a sleepy frontier bank from its humble beginnings in a dusty town. This was a modern, wired city that could turn one gunshot into a manhunt in minutes. He pushed back. He questioned the timing, the intel, the way Dutch talked more about making a mark than making it out alive. Hosea had always believed in clever cons, in slipping through the cracks of civilization while the old ways were dying. Blackwater felt different. It felt loud, exposed, theatrical. Was Dutch chasing money, or chasing the legend of Dutch van der Linde? What happened on that ferry remains half-shrouded in rumor and fear, but the outlines are clear. The gang boarded expecting control, a swift takeover, the guards disarmed, the money bags moved, the boat secured. Instead, something went wrong almost immediately. Shots rang out, civilians screamed, Pinkertons closed in faster than anyone had imagined. In moments, the neat script Hosea favored dissolved into chaos, smoke, and blood. Hosea did what he always did in a crisis, tried to salvage, to adapt, to pull Dutch and the others toward survival instead of spectacle. But in that frantic escape, Dutch made choices that revealed how far he had drifted. Split-second decisions favored defiance over retreat, pride over prudence, leaving bodies in the water and on the docks while the gang scattered through alleys and side streets. When the dust settled, there was no triumphant counting of bills, no plans for ships and new continents. There were dead gang members, missing money, Pinkertons swarming Blackwater, and the van der Linde gang forced to abandon a rich town for frozen mountains. As they rode toward Coulter, exhausted and half-starved, Hosea understood what the others could not yet admit. The big score had not bought their freedom. It had broken the dream, and something in Dutch had cracked in a way that might never be mended. The ride into Coulter was not an escape. It was a retreat. Snow swallowed sound, wind burned exposed skin, and the proud van der Linde gang, once the living embodiment of defiance, crawled into the mountains starving, freezing, wounded, and grieving. Men who had ridden through gunfire without flinching now hunched in their saddles, teeth chattering, eyes hollow. Among them, Hosea Matthews felt every year in his bones. He had always been older than most, but in that blizzard he seemed ancient. His hands shook when he dismounted, his breath came in ragged bursts, and the cold cut through him in a way it did not cut through Arthur or Javier. Yet, while his body faltered, his mind had never been sharper. As they dragged wagons into place and tried to coax life from damp wood, Hosea replayed Blackwater again and again, every shouted order, every panicked shot, every decision Dutch had made in those final frantic minutes. Dutch said the Pinkertons had forced his hand. Dutch said there had been no choice. Dutch said the plan had been sound and fate had betrayed them. Hosea listened to those words in the flicker of firelight, nodding, comforting, offering the loyalty a best friend owed. But in the truest sense, he was running a different ledger in his head, testing every explanation against instincts honed from its humble beginnings, back when their philosophy had been caution wrapped in charm rather than dynamite wrapped in speeches. In the cramped, frozen cabins of Coulter, their conversations changed. Hosea did not challenge Dutch in front of the others. He knew that would tear the family apart faster than any blizzard. Instead, he chose his moments. Late at night, when the wind howled and Dutch stared at the door as if civilization itself might burst through it, Hosea leaned in quietly. Think about the long game. Keep them fed, keep them together, avoid noise. Do not chase blood just to feel powerful again. Was there still a path to freedom that did not run through another massacre? Dutch heard him, but the hearing and the heeding were no longer the same thing. That was the first real fracture. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, now narrowed to two men in a dark room, one trying to slow the other before he ran off a cliff. Around them, the younger members clung to faith. Arthur rode into the storm without question. Javier spoke of Dutch's genius as if it were a law of nature. Bill needed orders, not doubts. Hosea comforted them, told stories by the fire, reminded them of past escapes. Yet there was a new distance in his eyes. He no longer fully believed that Dutch would always find a way out. He simply understood that the others needed to believe it a little longer. Somewhere in that snowbound misery, Hosea began to see the shape of the end. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the gang's dream of permanent rebellion against civilization had already been mortally wounded at Blackwater. His role shifted. He was no longer building a future, he was containing a collapse, trying to limit the damage Dutch might do to this fragile family and to every lost soul still following him into the dark. The storm outside would pass. The storm inside Dutch was only beginning, and Coulter was its first warning. When the snow finally melted behind them and the gang rode down from the mountains, the world seemed to open up again. Not into the promised land Dutch had once described, but into something older, dustier, and far more familiar, the cattle town of Valentine. Valentine was a story of the frontier in miniature, muddy Main Street, leaning wooden storefronts, a saloon that never really slept, and the lowing of cattle drifting in from the stockyards. To Dutch and Hosea, it felt from its humble beginnings like stepping back into the very beginning of their partnership, into a world where a quick tongue and a good plan could still outmatch a gun. Civilization was creeping in, but here, the old ways were dying slowly. Hosea seized on that. If Blackwater had been the end of one era, Valentine, in his mind, could be the careful rebirth of another. He pushed hard for low violence, high brain jobs, schemes that would rebuild not just the gang's coffers, but its shaken confidence. No more fairies, no more massacres, just paper, polish, and performance. The horse auction scam became his masterpiece in this new phase. He and Arthur rode out to steal a valuable horse, then rode back into town with Hosea reinvented as a respectable gentleman trader, armed with forged papers and an easy smile. Where Dutch now spoke in sermons, Hosea spoke in contracts, receipts, and invented histories. The Mark saw a harmless old man with a fine animal and a tidy story. Hosea saw leverage, timing, and human vanity. In Valentine, Hosea was in the truest sense the living embodiment of the gang's original philosophy. He charmed stable owners, improvised aliases, and, in quiet moments, turned each con into a lesson. Arthur was reminded how to read a man's eyes, not just his holster. John was nudged to think about exits before entrances. Even the rougher hands watched as Hosea showed that the right word, at the right moment, could move more money than a rifle ever could. Wasn't this what Dutch had once promised? Freedom through wit rather than slaughter? But Dutch was already restless. While Hosea was content with steady, clever scores, Dutch stood on the Valentine balcony, staring past the town toward bigger horizons. He listened to Hosea, nodded at the talk of caution and patience. then drifted back to fantasies of grand banks, rich families, and enemies humbled in fire. To him, these modest cons were a means to an end. To Hosea, they were the end that might still save them. On the surface, the gang functioned again. Campfires burned, money trickled in, laughter returned to the evenings. Yet Hosea could feel the balance tilting. His voice no longer stopped Dutch's worst impulses, it only delayed them. The world was changing, and the man he had once guided was slipping beyond his reach. Valentine felt almost peaceful, almost normal. But beneath the calm, Hosea sensed that the next move Dutch proposed would not be a con at all, but the first real step toward something far more dangerous. The next move took them south, into Rhodes. On the surface, it was a sleepy little town framed by magnolia trees and polite smiles. Underneath, it was a powder keg. For Hosea Matthews, it was a familiar kind of playground. Old money, old grudges, and two families so proud they would rather burn the county than lose face. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang had survived by reading the world better than the world read them. In Rhodes, Hosea immediately understood the lay of the land. The Greys and the Braithwaites were the living embodiment of a dying aristocracy, clinging to faded plantations and fading power while the world was changing around them. Dutch saw opportunity. Hosea saw opportunity and danger in equal measure. The plan they crafted together was, in the truest sense, a classic Hosea construction: play both sides, never shed more blood than necessary, and turn ancient resentment into quick profit. Arthur and the others would pose as hired hands, errand boys, trusted outsiders. They would listen, stoke class tensions, and quietly siphon money from men who believed themselves untouchable. Why rob banks under Pinkerton guns when two feuding dynasties could be nudged into paying for their own downfall? Hosea's insight showed in the small moments. He warned Arthur not to underestimate old money, reminding him that a plantation smile could hide a ledger full of debts and a cellar full of guns. At the Braithwaite Manor, he watched Catherine Braithwaite's eyes more than her words, catching the flicker of contempt whenever Dutch spoke about freedom and civilization. At the Grey estate, he noted which sons deferred, which bristled, which drank too much when the conversation turned to honor. Every glance was data, every pause in a sentence was a warning. Again and again, he tried to keep Dutch's ego from turning a careful con into a crusade. When Dutch started talking about teaching these families a lesson, Hosea quietly steered the talk back to numbers, to timelines, to escape routes. This was supposed to be a story of precision, not vengeance. He could live with stirring up conflict between powerful men who had spent decades exploiting others. He could not stomach needless cruelty or innocent blood spilled for spectacle. Yet even here, the balance was slipping. Dutch enjoyed the theater of Rhodes too much, the costumes, the speeches, the chance to humiliate the old order. Hosea noticed the way Dutch's eyes lit up when chaos loomed, how each small success made him hungrier for something grander, louder, more dangerous. The old ways were dying, and Dutch did not just want to survive that death. He wanted to perform it on stage. Hosea tried to keep the script tight, but the story was drifting beyond him. The careful game between Greys and Braithwaites would not end with quiet profit. It would end in gunfire and grief, another bloody mess born from dreams curdling into delusions. And in Rhodes, for the first time, Hosea began to understand that he was losing control of the story he had helped write from the very beginning. Hosea could feel it in his bones before anyone said it out loud. The con was slipping, the script was fraying, and Dutch's grand philosophy was starting to sound less like a plan and more like a sermon shouted over approaching thunder. Around the campfires at Clemens Point and Shady Bell, the tone began to change. Where there had once been easy stories of past scores and future dreams, there were quieter questions, drifting from Hosea's side of the flames. Was this still a story of freedom and family, or just a long, desperate run from the consequences of their own pride? In the glow of lantern light, he would ask Dutch, gently but clearly, what they were really fighting for now, and why every new idea seemed to demand more blood than the last. At first, those doubts came in private, in the way they always had from the very beginning. Two old partners stepping aside, sharing a bottle, weighing risk and reward. But the world was changing, and so was Dutch. Hosea would suggest restraint, another con instead of another gunfight, and Dutch would brush him off with talk of destiny and civilization closing in. The old ways were dying, Dutch would say. Hosea heard something else in that, an excuse. So Hosea turned more and more to Arthur. Late nights by the water, or on the porch of some borrowed house, the old conman let the mask slip. He admitted he was tired. He admitted he did not know how much longer they could keep outrunning railroads, Pinkertons, and their own history. He told Arthur, in the truest sense, that the dream had always been to take the money and disappear. Not to die making a point. Why not leave now, while there was still something left to save? Why not walk away before Dutch's pride walked them all into the grave? Here the pattern interrupt came. Hosea, the living embodiment of practical outlaw cunning, started talking not about the next town, but about other worlds. Tahiti, Australia, some distant shore beyond the reach of the law, beyond the telegraph wires and iron tracks. He floated these ideas as quiet exits, soft landings for an aging family. Dutch heard them as fuel. What Hosea meant as an escape hatch, Dutch would twist into a new obsession, a fantasy of paradise that required one more score, and then another, and then another. The shift became visible to everyone. Around the fire, when Dutch spun his speeches about loyalty and betrayal, about dreams and delusions, Hosea no longer nodded along in silence. He would interject, question a detail, remind Dutch that they had mouths to feed, not a revolution to lead. Once, those corrections had been offered behind closed doors. Now they came in front of Bill, Javier, even the newer faces who only knew the legend, not the man. In those moments, a fork in the road came into focus for Hosea. Either Dutch would finally listen, bend his pride, and guide the gang toward a quiet ending, or the story that had risen from its humble beginnings would crash into catastrophe. He could not yet see the exact shape of that disaster, but he could feel it coming, as surely as a storm rolling over the bayou, waiting for one last, fatal decision. That storm finally takes shape when the gang rides into Saint Denis. The mist and moss of the bayou fall away, and there it is on the horizon, smokestacks, chimneys, and a forest of telegraph poles, the living embodiment of the world Hosea has been dreading for years. Saint Denis is not a town. It is a machine. Tram bells clang through the night, factory whistles scream at dawn, and electric lights burn away the darkness where outlaws once hid. Cobblestone streets choke with carriages and trolleys, with bankers in pressed suits and laborers coated in soot. Steamships crowd the docks, their funnels coughing smoke over warehouses stacked with goods from every corner of the world. This is not the open range where a fast horse and a loaded rifle mean freedom. This is civilization on the march, and the old ways were dying beneath its wheels. Hosea feels it the moment his boots hit the pavement. He studies the crowds, the police patrols, the Pinkerton agents who do not bother to hide their presence. He is fascinated, in the truest sense, by the precision of it all, timetables, schedules, routines, but that fascination comes with a chill. In a place where every movement is tracked, where messages race across telegraph wires in seconds, what chance does a wandering outlaw family have? Here, a single mistake will not just anger a local sheriff, it will summon an entire system. So Hosea does what he has always done. He adapts. He walks the financial district at different hours, counts the guards outside the Lemoyne National Bank, notes which clerks stay late and which doors never seem to open. He watches the trolley station, the way people pour in and out in waves, the way armed escorts meet certain trains. His philosophy has always favored brains over blood, and in Saint Denis that belief hardens into a rule. Any job must be clean, quick, and precise, or it must not happen at all. Dutch, though, sees something else. Where Hosea sees a machine, Dutch sees a stage. To him, Saint Denis is proof that the gang story is not over, but reaching its grandest chapter. One last legendary score, one last demonstration that his idealistic rebellion can still outwit the modern world. He talks of the bank as if it were destiny, of the city as an audience waiting to be astonished. Hosea hears the old music in his friend's voice and feels only dread, because this, from its humble beginnings, is the future Hosea has warned about since the very beginning, a world of Pinkertons on every corner, of telegraphs ringing alarms, of armored trolleys and instant consequences. He walks its streets knowing that once the gang challenges this city, there may be no coming back. And as Dutch's eyes fix on the bank and the trolley lines, Hosea cannot shake the feeling that the storm he sensed over the bayou is about to break in the heart of Saint Denis itself. So when Dutch settles on the St. Denis Bank and its trolley lines, Hosea treats the plan not as a chance for glory, but as a final exam. This is where the gang's philosophy is put to the test in the heart of civilization. Brains before blood. Precision over bravado. In the truest sense, it is Hosea's last attempt to prove that the old ways were dying, but not dead yet. From the very beginning of the trolley station setup, Hosea moves through the city like a quiet architect. He walks the platforms, notes the patrol patterns, studies the timetables, and sketches out an operation that depends on timing rather than gunplay. The trolley station will be the artery of the escape, not a battlefield. Quick in, quick out, minimal noise. Every variable accounted for, every man given a place and a purpose. Around the planning table, Hosea's voice is calm, almost gentle, but there is steel underneath. He lays out contingencies for delays, for extra law, for a guard who does not scare easy. If the trolley is late, they fall back. If the streets clog, they break off. No heroics, no last stands. In a world of Pinkertons and telegraphs, the real outlaw is the one who vanishes before the city even knows it has been robbed. Dutch listens, but not as he once did. Where Hosea sees pressure points and exit routes, Dutch talks about making a statement, about showing St. Denis that the Van der Linde gang still commands fear. When Hosea warns that too many moving parts invite disaster, Dutch brushes it aside with a smile and a story of past triumphs. They have beaten worse odds. They have escaped tighter nooses. What is one more dance with death? The others feel the tension, even if they cannot name it. Arthur gravitates toward Hosea's side of the table, asking about fallback positions and disguises. John worries about Abigail and Jack if the law floods the streets. Hosea answers each concern with patient detail, as if sheer professionalism can hold back the tide. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, playing out in the margins of a city map. Yet small cracks keep showing. Dutch ignores a warning about the bank's upgraded security. He laughs off Hosea's concern that the trolley station is too exposed, that armored response will be instant. The symbolic victory matters more to Dutch now than the clean getaway. He wants the world to remember his name, even as the world was changing into something that no longer has room for men like him. So Hosea doubles down. He refines the timing, rehearses the roles, repeats the rules, no unnecessary killing, no improvisation, no vanity. If this works, he tells himself, it proves that his way still has value, that from its humble beginnings, their gang was never just about gunsmoke and bodies on the street. But beneath that hope lies a quiet dread. What if this is not just another job? What if this is the last, best chance for reason to win, before Dutch and the gang follow the trolley line straight into the jaws of a new, merciless age? The St. Denis bank job begins with a strange, uneasy perfection. For a moment, it almost proves Hosea right. The gang moves through the marble halls and polished counters with rehearsed precision, Dutch's voice calm, Arthur steady. The others slotting into place. In the heart of a modern city, this old outlaw family still believes it can bend civilization to its will. Outside, Hosea plays his role to the hilt. The aging gentleman, the investor, the harmless distraction. He lingers near the steps in the street, eyes always moving, watching the patrols, the trolleys, the crowds. This is his design, a clean withdrawal, a quick escape to the docks, a ship out of a world that no longer wants men like them. From its humble beginnings, their partnership had relied on this balance. Dutch's fire, Hosea's caution, and here, in St. Denis, that balance feels fragile but intact. Then the Pinkertons arrive, and the illusion dies. Sirens, shouting, the clatter of boots on stone. Agent Milton and his men do not come as hapless deputies or greedy bankers. They come as the living embodiment of the new order, organized, disciplined, backed by the full machinery of law and money. In an instant, the robbery stops being a story of clever rogues and becomes a siege, steel jaws closing around the bank from every alley and rooftop. Hosea is caught in that tightening ring. Separated from the others in the confusion, he is seized, disarmed, dragged forward as the Pinkertons form a cordon. Milton recognizes his value immediately. This is not just an old man. This is Dutch van der Linde's oldest friend, the strategist, the conscience. Hosea knows it too. He keeps his voice level, tries to bargain, to stall, to make Milton talk. Every second he gains is a second for Dutch and Arthur to think, to find some narrow path out. But Milton's goal is not negotiation. It is psychological warfare. He hauls Hosea into the open, facing the shattered windows where Dutch and Arthur are pinned down. The city noise falls away in their ears. Milton taunts Dutch's philosophy, mocks his dreams of freedom, calls the gang a relic in a world that is moving on without them. Hosea, bruised and held at gunpoint, still tries to steady Dutch with his eyes, to be that last anchor of reason. The gunshot is simple. The impact is not. Hosea crumples in the street, executed in front of the man he had guided from the very beginning and the crotch he had helped raise. Dutch's horrified scream is more than grief, it is something breaking. In that instant, the gang loses its strategist, its moral compass, its quiet skeptic. Dutch loses the one voice he truly listened to, the last restraint on his growing delusions. From here, the descent will not merely continue, it will accelerate. With Hosea gone, who is left to tell Dutch no? And when the gang finally staggers out of Saint Denis, bleeding and leaderless in spirit, what new shape will Dutch's rage take? The answer comes in gunfire. The gang does not walk out of Saint Denis, it is blasted out of it, stumbling through a storm of bullets, smoke, and ringing church bells as the city erupts around them. The carefully planned robbery becomes a frantic flight across rooftops and alleyways, the living embodiment of a dream collapsing in real time. Dutch is at the center of it, but he is not leading in the way Hosea would have recognized. He is shouting orders, firing wildly, shoving past civilians and Pinkertons with equal fury. Every explosion, every fallen gang member feeds something dark inside him. Even as Arthur and the others scramble simply to survive, Dutch is already raging about betrayal, about Leviticus Cornwall, about Milton, about revenge. Survival is no longer the point. Vengeance is. Arthur feels the loss before he can name it. Hosea's body is still cooling on the bank steps, and yet the absence travels with them through every back street and sewer tunnel. Grief hits him in sharp, disorienting flashes, but the situation allows no time to stop. He drags Lenny's memory with him, hauls a wounded John, shouts to keep Bill and Javier moving. The man who taught him to think is gone, and the man who taught him to dream is no longer thinking at all. On that boat out of Saint Denis, rocking in the dark water, the contrast is brutal. Dutch paces and rants, insisting this was a setup, insisting the world is against them, insisting that Hosea's death proves everything he ever said about civilization and betrayal. Arthur, exhausted and hollow, says little. When he does question, Dutch snaps, turns it back on him, on everyone. The old ways were dying, but in that moment, Dutch decides the world must die with them. The impact in camp is immediate. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had always had two centers of gravity, Dutch's fire and Hosea's calm. Now only the fire remains. There is no one to sit Dutch down by the fire and quietly dismantle his worst ideas. No one to reorganize the chaos, to send people on sensible errands, to turn panic into a plan. Susan Grimshaw can enforce rules, Arthur can bark orders, but neither can tell Dutch, in the truest sense, that this is madness and make it stick. Small shifts reveal a larger break. Dutch starts dismissing concerns with open contempt. When Charles warns a plan is too risky, Dutch doubles down. When Arthur suggests lying low, Dutch hears cowardice. Every setback becomes proof of persecution, every doubt a hint of betrayal. Micah's whispers about rats and traitors find fertile soil, because there is no Hosea to counter with reasoned skepticism and a bitter joke. This is more than grief, it is a turning point. The gang's story becomes a story of momentum without breaks, of loyalty without question, of dreams without limits. With Hosea gone, Dutch's self-image goes unchallenged. Who is left to remind him of the philosophy they once shared, rather than the delusions he now embraces? From this night on, the gang's fate is effectively sealed. The last true check on Dutch's power has fallen, and the lost soul who once needed guidance now believes he needs none at all. The question now is not whether the Van der Linde gang will fall, but how far Dutch will drag everyone before the end. With Hosea gone, Dutch keeps talking as if nothing has changed. The speeches are the same. The man giving them is not. What began as a story of resistance and freedom now becomes a shield, a script Dutch recites to protect self from doubt rather than to guide the gang through a changing world. In the very beginning, Dutch's language about freedom, family, and fighting civilization had weight because Hosea helped anchor it. Dutch would spin grand theories about the poor rising up, about outlaws being the living embodiment of true liberty, and Hosea would quietly translate that philosophy into something the gang could actually live. When Dutch raged about the system, Hosea chose targets that were rich, cruel, or corrupt. When Dutch promised a better life, Hosea made sure there was money in the box and food on the fire. Hosea was the filter. When Dutch's rhetoric drifted too far from reality, Hosea gently pulled him back, turning sermons into plans and dreams into workable schemes. If Dutch promised the gang they were almost free, Hosea would be the one counting the take, weighing the risk, and saying, "Not yet, but soon." Without that quiet correction, the gap between what Dutch said and what Dutch did was kept small enough that Arthur and the others could still believe. After Saint Denis, that gap becomes a chasm. Dutch still talks about family, still calls everyone sons and daughters, still insists that loyalty is all that matters. Yet his decisions grow more violent, more erratic, more desperate. The massacre in Strawberry, the cold-blooded killing of Angelo Bronte, the blind insistence on Tahiti after Hosea, the very man who first floated leaving America, has died. Each move is framed as part of a plan, but what plan ends with bodies in the street and the gang starving in a cave? Arthur begins to see it. At Shady Belle, and then Beaver Hollow, he hears the same phrases he has heard since his youth: one more score, one last job, one final ride to freedom. But now those words are used to silence questions, to crush dissent, to paint any concern as betrayal. When Arthur asks about the missing money, when he worries about John's family, Dutch does not answer. He accuses. He deflects. He hides behind the very ideals he claims to defend. Hosea, in the truest sense, would have done the opposite. He would have acknowledged the danger, admitted the uncertainty, and tried to steer Dutch toward survival rather than spectacle. Instead, Dutch turns his ideology into a performance for himself. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and rather than accept his own role in the gang's suffering, he doubles down on the myth that only the system is to blame. The question now is not what Dutch believes, but whether he believes anything beyond the sound of his own voice. And as that voice grows louder, the next cracks in the gang's fragile unity begin to show. As Dutch's voice rises, another voice begins to echo in Arthur's head. Not the roar of a prophet, but the quiet, measured cadence of an old conman who always asked one simple question before a job: what happens after? From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang survived because Hosea taught them to think 3 moves ahead. Read the mark, question the motive, plan for the consequences. Those lessons had once made Arthur the perfect lieutenant, the living embodiment of Dutch and Hosea's shared philosophy. Now, in the smoky camps of Shady Belle and the suffocating darkness of Beaver Hollow, those same lessons make it impossible for him to ignore Dutch's contradictions. When Dutch talks about Tahiti after Saint Denis, Arthur hears Hosea asking whether this is a plan or a fantasy. When Dutch insists that one more score will fix everything, Arthur remembers Hosea's warnings at Clemens Point, when the old man quietly admitted that the world was changing and the gang was running out of road. The very beginning of Arthur's loyalty had been built on the idea that Dutch listened to Hosea. With Hosea gone, the silences between Dutch's speeches become deafening. Arthur starts running Hosea's calculations in his own mind. At Guarma, when Dutch chooses vengeance over escape, Arthur wonders what Hosea would say about throwing lives away on a principle that keeps shifting. Back in the mainland, every time Dutch shrugs off risk, Arthur notices the missing step where Hosea would have weighed the cost in blood, not just in dollars. Dutch still talks about freedom and family, but Arthur's eyes track the people who actually bleed for those dreams. Then comes the cough, the blood in the handkerchief. Tuberculosis turns Arthur's life into a countdown, and that ticking clock sharpens Hosea's teachings into something merciless. Facing his own end, Arthur begins to see the gang's story with Hosea's clarity, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of men who preached honor while hiding from their own reflection. Patterns emerge, Dutch's grand speeches after every disaster, the way blame always flows outward, the way doubt is treated as treason. In that vacuum, Arthur tries to step into Hosea's role. He suggests leaving for Canada, for some quiet corner where the Pinkertons might forget them. He urges Dutch to spare the innocents, to walk away from Colm's hanging, to abandon Micah's reckless provocations. He shields John, Abigail, Jack, and even Sadie where he can, trying to protect the vulnerable from the worst of Dutch's spiraling decisions. In the truest sense, he becomes the gang's conscience, even as his own body fails. The tragedy is simple and cruel. Hosea spent decades teaching Arthur to think for himself, to see the world as it really was, rather than how Dutch imagined it to be. That legacy now demands a terrible choice: remain loyal to the man Hosea loved most, or honor what Hosea actually believed about survival, responsibility, and truth. Arthur cannot do both. So when the final plans grow wilder, when Dutch's eyes grow colder, Arthur's path bends away from the man who raised him and towards something Hosea had always hoped for, but never quite achieved: an honest reckoning. The question is no longer whether Dutch has lost his way, but what Arthur is willing to sacrifice to set even one person free from the ruins of this dying outlaw family. For John Marston, that honest reckoning began much earlier, long before Arthur could admit the truth to himself. From the very beginning, John was the skeptic in a camp built on belief. He had grown up abandoned, beaten, tossed between neglect and violence. And the result was simple: he did not trust anyone who called himself a leader. Not fully, not ever. Hosea understood that. He did not try to cure it, because he knew where it came from. John's childhood was a story of broken promises and false fathers, and Dutch's grand philosophy, with its speeches about freedom and civilization, could never quite erase those scars. Hosea could offer guidance, could soften Dutch's edges, could pull John aside after an argument and explain what Dutch meant rather than what Dutch said. But he could not make John forget what the world had already taught him. So Hosea tried something different. He tried to bridge the gap between his two surrogate sons. When Arthur grumbled that John complained too much, Hosea would remind him that doubt was not disloyalty, that a man who questioned plans might one day save everyone's life. When John sneered that Arthur was blindly loyal, Hosea would quietly insist that Arthur's faith was born from genuine gratitude, not stupidity, from its humble beginnings when Dutch and Hosea had pulled a half-starved boy off the streets and given him a family. In those moments around the fire, or riding back from a con in Valentine, Hosea became the living embodiment of compromise inside the gang. He praised John's caution, he praised Arthur's devotion, and he tried to weld them into a single, balanced future for this outlaw family. Could the gang survive on both skepticism and faith, on both hard questions and hard loyalty? Hosea believed it might. Then Saint Denis tore that balance apart. With Hosea gone, John lost one of the few voices he trusted to tell the truth about Dutch. Arthur's doubts were growing, but in John's mind, Arthur was still too close to the old dream, still chained to Dutch by years of shared blood and gratitude. Without Hosea's calm, almost clinical honesty, there was little reason for John to believe Dutch would ever truly change. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but Dutch was not. So when Dutch leaves John to rot in Sisika, when plans turn from desperate to delusional, John begins to remember Hosea's warnings. Loyalty has a line. Cross it, and it becomes self-destruction. Hosea had stayed for Dutch, then died for Dutch, and what had that sacrifice really bought? John has Abigail, he has Jack, and in the truest sense, he finally understands Hosea's quiet lesson. A man must protect his family first, even if that means walking away from the only home he has ever known. That decision to leave the gang is not a clean break. It becomes a curse. In Red Dead Redemption, John is a man dragged back through the ashes of his past, haunted by the gang's legacy, yet still chasing Hosea's quieter, practical morality. He tries to build a ranch instead of a revolution, to raise a son instead of raise hell, to live small in a world that once promised him something grand. It is a story of freedom and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, echoing Hosea's own conflict in a harsher, lonelier age. And even as John hunts the last remnants of his old family, the question Hosea planted never fully dies. How much of that old life can be buried, and how much will always come riding back over the horizon? Hosea's question lingers over the years that follow, because the moment his voice is silenced in Saint Denis, the answer becomes painfully clear. The old ways were dying, but without Hosea there to interpret that loss, Dutch does not adapt. He unravels. A story of freedom and betrayal turns inward, as the gang's greatest danger stops being Pinkertons or progress, and becomes the man at its center. From the very beginning, Hosea had been Dutch's anchor, the one person who could puncture his grand speeches with a quiet look or a well-timed joke. When that anchor is blown apart on the steps of the bank, Dutch is not just grieving a friend, he is suddenly unmoored in the truest sense. The world was changing, his philosophy was failing, and the one man who could say that aloud without being cast out is gone. What fills that silence? Into that vacuum walks Micah Bell, always nearby, always agreeable, always ready with the words Dutch most wants to hear. Where Hosea would question, Micah affirms. Where Hosea would suggest a con, Micah demands a massacre. Every setback becomes proof, in Micah's telling, that they have not gone far enough, not hit hard enough, not bled enough. And when Arthur or John or anyone else hesitates, Micah frames it as betrayal, as weakness, as proof that they never truly believed. Hosea would have seen him for what he was. A lifetime of reading marks, liars, and fellow conmen had trained Hosea to spot the exact blend of flattery and opportunism Micah embodies, the living embodiment of a bad gamble wrapped in compliments and false loyalty. The man who once tried to rob Dutch and Hosea and ended up their partner would have recognized another predator circling an aging outlaw who could no longer tell friend from sycophant. Micah's act is good, but not that good. Without Hosea's quiet authority, the nature of disagreement inside the camp changes. Debates that once ended with a compromise now spiral into shouting matches. At Horseshoe Overlook or Clemens Point, Hosea could stand between Dutch and Arthur, translating Dutch's dreams into something workable and Arthur's doubts into something Dutch could tolerate. After Saint Denis, there is no translator. Every challenge to Dutch's plans feels, to him, like a personal attack, an accusation that his entire life has been a lie. How does a man that proud survive that thought? Micah thrives in that poisoned air. He encourages Dutch's paranoia, feeds every suspicion, and turns internal fractures into open wounds. He is not just an external snake who slithers into a healthy garden. He is a symptom of a deeper rot, the natural consequence of Hosea's absence. From its humble beginnings as a partnership built on balance and shared control, the Van der Linde gang becomes a stage for one man's unraveling, drawn inevitably toward the loudest voice that still tells him he is right. From the moment Hosea falls on those Saint Denis steps, the gang's dream does not explode all at once. It frays. It unravels, thread by thread, as the survivors stumble from one temporary refuge to the next, chasing a future that has already died. What began as a story of freedom and family becomes a slow-motion collapse, stretched across swamps, mountains, and sheer denial. The first camp after Saint Denis is not a home at all, but a hiding place. The gang slinks into the bayou, into the fetid shadows around Shady Bell, surrounded by mud, mosquitoes, and the distant glow of a city that has just chewed them up. Dutch calls it a setback, a pause before the next grand plan. In truth, the move signals a shift. This camp is about survival, not building anything. The laughter that once floated over Lemoyne evenings now comes in short, nervous bursts, if at all. Without Hosea, daily life changes in ways that are subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. Chores go unfinished, supplies run low, arguments drag on because there is no calm voice to cut through them. Susan Grimshaw still barks orders, but she enforces rules. Hosea once enforced perspective. Around the fire, the stories grow harsher, the silence is longer. Dutch talks more than ever, yet somehow the camp feels leaderless, drifting between his speeches and Micah's venom. Each relocation grows more frantic, from the swamps to the temporary mountain refuge near Roanoke Ridge, and finally into the rotten cave of Beaver Hollow. The geography mirrors the gang's descent. They move higher into the hills, yet sink lower in spirit. The old ways were dying, and every new camp looks less like the mobile commune Dutch and Hosea imagined, and more like a cornered outlaw nest, waiting for the next raid or betrayal. In this chaos, Dutch's philosophy curdles into cruelty. He endorses executions he once would have condemned, abandons allies such as the Wapiti when their usefulness wanes, and justifies every broken promise as a necessary sacrifice for a payoff that never comes. The man who once prided himself on sparing women and children now shrugs at collateral damage, insisting that civilization has left them no choice. Is this still resistance, or just vengeance dressed up in old rhetoric? Arthur feels the difference keenly. He watches the women, the children, The less hardened men flinch at Dutch's new temper, and he begins to step into the space Hosea left behind. He escorts Abigail and Jack away from danger, shields Tilly and Mary Beth from Micah's poison, and quietly shares food with those Dutch forgets in his obsession with one last score. In the truest sense, Arthur becomes the living embodiment of Hosea's better instincts, even as his own faith in Dutch erodes. By Beaver Hollow, the gang is no longer the family Hosea helped build. It has become a cult of personality orbiting Dutch, sustained by fear, exhaustion, and old loyalty that no longer fits the man he is. Those who question are branded traitors. Those who stay silent are rewarded with more lies. And as the cave walls close in, one question hangs over every whispered conversation. Who will be the first to walk away, and who will pay the price for doing it? In that suffocating darkness of Beaver Hollow, as loyalty curdles into fear, one presence will not leave Arthur alone. Hosea is gone, but his shadow is everywhere. In the quiet between arguments, in the long rides through rain and mud, in the moments when Dutch's voice grows too loud, Arthur hears another sound in his memory. Hosea's dry, amused laugh, cutting through tension the way it once cut through gun smoke. He remembers the old man's warnings, repeated from the very beginning of his outlaw life. Dutch has a temper. Dutch has pride. Dutch needs someone to tell him no. Around the campfire at Horseshoe Overlook, on the porch at Clemens Point, Hosea would lean back, studying Dutch with those tired, knowing eyes, and mutter that they should have left years ago, before the world closed in. It had sounded like an old man's complaint. Now it sounds like prophecy. Those memories do not stay as simple nostalgia. They harden into a kind of moral compass. When Dutch orders John abandoned in the chaos of Saint Denis, when he dismisses the suffering of the Wapiti or the workers in the factory, Arthur feels that old voice in his head asking a simple question. Is this who we said we were? The story of the Van der Linde gang was supposed to be a story of freedom and family, of striking back at a corrupt civilization. Hosea's philosophy had always been brains over bullets, survival over spectacle, compassion where possible. In the truest sense, he had been the living embodiment of the gang's better angels. So when Arthur chooses to help rains fall, to shield John's escape, to give money to those who have nothing, he is not following Dutch anymore. He is following the man who once told him that there is a point where running stops and making amends begins. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Hosea had seen that long before the others. Arthur clings to that vision as everything else falls apart. Regret seeps into every recollection. Arthur is not only haunted by the men he has killed and the towns he has helped terrorize, but by the times he stood beside Dutch against Hosea's hesitation. When Hosea questioned the Blackwater ferry job and Arthur backed Dutch. When Hosea pushed for a quiet life in the Grizzlies and Dutch pulled them back towards Saint Denis. Each memory is another weight on Arthur's chest. He did not just fail himself, he helped push Hosea's best friend down the path Hosea feared most. In the long, fevered rides after his diagnosis, Arthur starts to imagine alternate futures. A Tahiti that might actually have been, with Hosea haggling over mangoes instead of bonds. A worn little house on some forgotten hill, where an old conman and an aging gunman argue over newspapers and watch civilization roll past. From its humble beginnings, the gang had been offered exits, doors out of the fire. They had chances to walk away, and they did not take them. That is the bitter truth Arthur finally accepts. Dutch's speeches will fade, his grand plans exposed as dreams and delusions. Hosea's true legacy survives somewhere else, in Arthur's last acts of kindness, in his decision to save John, in his refusal to abandon the weak even when it costs him everything. As Arthur rides toward his own ending, one question remains hanging in the air. Waiting for an answer in blood and dust, when the running finally stops, who will choose to make things right? That answer does not come quickly. It comes in the slow suffocation of the final camps, where the air itself feels thinner and every whispered conversation sounds like a betrayal waiting to happen. This is still a story of outlaws on the run, but the romance is gone. The tents at Beaver Hollow and the last way stations after are filled with packed bags, hidden coin, and eyes that never quite meet. From its humble beginnings as a roaming family chasing freedom, the Van der Linde gang becomes a frightened caravan. Men who once sang around the fire now hunch over bedrolls, quietly sorting what they can carry. Women fold blankets with one hand and keep the other near a hidden pistol. Dutch spends more time shut in his tent or pacing alone at the edge of the cave, muttering about loyalty and civilization, seeing enemies in every shadow. The world was changing, and in his mind, it was changing against him. Without Hosea, that paranoia has no counterweight. Decisions that once passed through two minds now erupt from one wounded ego. Dutch abandons John and Sisika without a serious rescue plan, leaves the wounded and the weak behind when the Pinkertons close in, and dismisses pleas to help people he once swore were family. Each choice feels less like strategy and more like a man refusing to admit he is lost. Is this leadership, or just pride in its death throes? In earlier years, this is where Hosea would have stepped in. He would have walked straight into Dutch's tent, sat down, and forced a reckoning. Numbers, roots, options, the cold arithmetic of survival. He had done it after Blackwater, after Rhodes, after every disaster that threatened to turn philosophy into delusions. But now the only one willing to confront Dutch in the truest sense is Arthur, and Dutch no longer sees a partner when he looks at Arthur. He sees judgment, he sees a threat. Arthur's illness turns that rift into a race against time. Coughing blood into his handkerchief, growing weaker by the day, he tries to become the living embodiment of what Hosea had always preached: save who can be saved, expose who needs exposing, and give John and his family a chance at a different life. Every ride to warn someone, every argument with Dutch, every suspicion of Micah is a man fighting not just Pinkertons and outlaws, but his own failing body. Around them, the old ways were dying. Freedom had become fear, family had become factions. Yet Hosea's ghost still stands in the spaces between these men. Arthur's doubts, John's stubborn hope for Abigail and Jack, even Dutch's furious insistence that he has a plan. All of it is shaped by that missing voice. As the paths of Dutch, Arthur, John, and Micah twist toward each other, the stage is set for a final collision where Hosea's absence is felt in every shot fired. When those four finally stand face to face, whose philosophy will survive the gunsmoke? When those four finally stand face to face on the mountain, the gunsmoke carries more than bullets. It carries the last echoes of Hosea Matthews' philosophy, the remnants of a story of freedom, family, and the cost of choosing one over the other. Arthur's decision comes first, quiet but absolute. He sends John away. He turns his own death sentence into John's last chance at life, forcing the younger man down the path Hosea had been pointing toward since the very beginning. For years, that old conman had insisted John could be more than an outlaw, that Abigail and Jack deserved a home that was not built on blood. Now, with Pinkertons closing in and Dutch lost in his delusions, Arthur finally agrees. He makes Hosea's old argument with a gun in his hand and time running out. Those final conversations between Arthur and John are, in the truest sense, Hosea's voice speaking through a dying man. Arthur tells John to stop chasing Dutch's dreams, to protect Abigail, to raise Jack far from this collapsing world. He reminds him that loyalty without thought is just another prison, that staying is not bravery, but fear. Hosea had said all of this around campfires and on long rides, warning that the old ways were dying, that civilization would not spare men who refused to change. On that last ride, Arthur stops resisting those lessons. He passes them on instead. The confrontation with Micah is the brutal endpoint of Hosea's values. For years, Hosea had been the one to see through charming liars, to sense betrayal before it struck. He distrusted Micah, argued against his influence, and feared what Dutch became when he listened to the wrong voices. On the ridge above Beaver Hollow, Arthur finally does what Hosea would have done if he had lived long enough. He turns on the rot inside the family. He chooses honesty over blind loyalty, calling out the manipulation, the cruelty, the cowardice that Micah represents. In that moment, Arthur is not Dutch's enforcer. He is Hosea's student, finishing the lesson in blood. Whether Arthur dies under a burning sky with high honor, watching the sunrise in weary peace, or crawls through the mud in the low honor path, snarling defiance to the end, his last moments are shaped by reflection and regret. He wants to do one right thing before the darkness takes him. Hosea spent years wondering if their story could ever end that way, if a man who had stolen so much from the world could give something back. Arthur's sacrifice for John is that answer. On that final mountain, Hosea is there. Not in body, but in the way Arthur thinks, in the way John listens, in the way Dutch hesitates when confronted with his own betrayal. The living embodiment of a dying philosophy, Hosea's influence outlives his heartbeat, and the question becomes chillingly simple. What survives when even that last echo fades? When that last echo fades, Dutch is left alone with the one voice he can no longer hear. What follows after the gang's collapse is not just the end of an outlaw, but a story of a leader wandering without the mirror that once held him to the truth. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's life had always been lived in dialogue with Hosea. After Beaver Hollow, that dialogue ends. In the years that follow, Dutch drifts through the dying West, a man out of time, forming smaller, harsher bands that mimic the old gang in shape but not in spirit. The camaraderie is gone, replaced by fear. The idealistic speeches remain, but the audience grows thinner, more desperate, less convinced. By the time Dutch reappears in the first Red Dead Redemption, hiding in the mountains with a ragged group of disillusioned young men, he is a bitter, radicalized shell of his former self, fighting a private war against a civilization he no longer understands. To grasp how far he has fallen, the memory of what Hosea once was to him is essential. Hosea did more than plan robberies or run cons. He functioned as Dutch's mirror. From the very beginning, he reflected back Dutch's charisma and philosophy, but also his vanity, his cruelty, his growing taste for violence. When Dutch raged about freedom, Hosea could quietly ask who was really benefiting. When Dutch called the gang a family, Hosea could remind him that family demanded responsibility, not just loyalty. Their arguments in camp, half friendly and half accusation, were the only moments Dutch was forced to confront the gap between his dreams and his delusions. Once Hosea is gone, that mirror shatters. No one left has the authority of shared history, the weight of having been there in the truest sense. Arthur tries to say you've changed, but Dutch hears betrayal. John questions him, and Dutch sees only ingratitude. By the time Dutch is recruiting angry, rootless young men in the 1910s, there is no one alive who knew him when the old ways were dying, when the philosophy still had limits, when a quiet conman could pull him aside and say, "No, this is wrong," and be believed. Without that check, Dutch drifts further from reality. His rhetoric grows more extreme, his enemies more abstract. Governments, progress, the entire modern world become a faceless conspiracy. Individual people matter less than the story he tells about himself. Sacrificing followers becomes easier, then habitual, then inevitable. In Coulter and Clemens Point, Dutch would risk much to rescue a captured ally. In his later years, he sends young men to die in doomed assaults, insisting their blood will mean something, even as the meaning evaporates. So when Dutch makes his last stand on that cliff in 1911, surrounded and cornered, still clinging to a narrative of noble resistance, the absence in the scene is almost louder than the gunfire. Imagine Hosea there, years earlier, catching Dutch before he crossed the final line. Would he have walked away from the edge? Or was this ending written the moment that quiet voice was silenced in Saint Denis? Because Dutch's exile is not just physical, it is the exile of a man from the only friend who ever truly saw him, and the world was changing faster than he could lie to himself. And in that void, another shadow waits, the man who watched both Dutch's rise and his ruin, and tried to build something different from their ashes. That shadow is John Marston, standing where Dutch once stood, trying to build from ruin what Hosea once only whispered about around dying campfires. Beecher's hope is not just a ranch, it is a test, a question. A story of whether an outlaw can ever truly walk back towards civilization without dragging the past through the mud behind him. On the surface, John's new life is simple. He mends fences, breaks horses, hauls feed, and rides into town for supplies. He argues with Abigail, tries to reach a son who prefers books to bullets, and watches the seasons move across those scrubby Great Plains. But every chore carries tension. Every quiet morning is haunted by the memory of train tracks, gunsmoke, and men who died so he could stand there pretending to be a decent husband and father. From its humble beginnings, this little patch of land is built on Hosea's ghost. John's insistence on earning money honestly, on taking ranch work from Edgar Ross instead of robbing banks again, echoes Hosea's old philosophy that the only real freedom left might be found in a small life lived carefully. John pushes Jack towards schooling, towards stories and civilization, because somewhere in the back of his mind lives an old conman who once told him that smart men survive longer than brave ones. That influence surfaces in quieter ways too. When government men promise him peace in exchange for one more job, John's eyes narrow with the same weary pragmatism Hosea once used on every lawman and land baron. He does not trust their smiles, does not trust their paperwork, understands that a deal with power is never free. He goes along because he must provide for his family, but he never mistakes their leverage for loyalty. Again and again, John reaches for negotiation before bloodshed. He talks to ranch hands instead of shooting them, tries to reason with rustlers, sizes up strangers with the same calm, measuring gaze Hosea used in every poker room and parlor. In the truest sense, he has become the living embodiment of Hosea's lesson that violence is a debt and the world always comes to collect. Yet John is no perfect student. When pushed, he still reaches for the gun. Old habits, old reflexes, old dreams of settling everything with a bullet drag him back into the very life he is trying to bury. Each time he rides out for Ross, each time he leaves Abigail and Jack behind, the echo of Hosea's long-voiced desire to get out while they still could hangs over the homestead like a storm cloud. For a brief, fragile moment, Beecher's hope becomes the closest anyone from the Linde gang comes to that quiet, honest life Hosea imagined when the world was changing and the old ways were dying. But how long can a house built on outlaw bones really stand, when the men who remember that past are still walking the earth with unfinished business? And at the center of that house of outlaw bones stands a question that reaches back to the very beginning of the Linde story. Whose house was it, really? Dutch's name is on the legend, but was Hosea Matthews the one quietly holding the walls in place while the world was changing and the old ways were dying? Leadership, in the truest sense, is more than speeches around a campfire or grand declarations about freedom and civilization. It is planning the next camp before the current one collapses, calming hot tempers before they turn into blood feuds, making sure there is money for bullets and bread on the same day. It is the invisible work of keeping a wandering family fed, housed, hopeful, and just disciplined enough not to tear itself apart. From its humble beginnings, Hosea handled most of that invisible burden. When Dutch dreamed about a camp in the trees, Hosea chose Coulter, Horseshoe Overlook, Clemens Point, and Shady Bell with an eye for defensible ground, nearby towns, and escape routes. When Dutch announced a big score, Hosea turned it into a sequence of robberies, cons, and odd jobs that kept the gang afloat between miracles. The Valentine auction scam, the careful dance between Braithwaite and Gray and Rhodes, even the St. Denis social climbing all bear his fingerprints. Brains first. Blood only when there is no other choice. Dutch was the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy in public. He spoke of ideals, of dreams of a life beyond the reach of civilization, of family as a chosen refuge from a corrupt world. Hosea, by contrast, built the structure that made those dreams survivable. He mediated when Bill and Javier clashed, when Micah needled Arthur, when resentment simmered beneath the tents. He enforced moral boundaries, pushing back against needless cruelty, steering the gang toward targets he could still pretend were deserving. How many arguments ended because Hosea quietly took a man aside and reminded him what they were supposed to stand for? This binary contrast becomes stark when crisis hits. Blackwater is a disaster, a story of betrayal and delusions colliding with Pinkerton efficiency, yet the gang staggers away, reorganizes, and even finds moments of rough joy in Valentine and Rhodes. Hosea is there, soothing Dutch's wounded pride, redirecting his rage into plans that, while risky, still have some grounding in reality. The dream bends, but it does not yet break. St. Denis is different. Hosea dies on those marble steps, and with him goes the last real restraint on Dutch's spiraling mind. After that, camps are no longer chosen with care, they are burrows dug by a wounded animal. Plans become rants. Disputes turn into fractures. The family that once moved as a unit becomes a scattering of lost soul survivors. So was Hosea the real leader all along, the true heart of the Linde experiment, the one who believed in the family more than the myth? To answer that, the story has to return to where Dutch and Hosea first met, with two conmen trying to rob each other and accidentally founding a philosophy that would outlive them both. From that moment in 1877, when two men tried to rob each other and instead built a philosophy, a question hangs over the entire story of the Linde gang. If Hosea Matthews had survived St. Denis, could he have saved Dutch from himself? Was the fall of this idealistic outlaw family avoidable, Or had the world already written their ending in blood and railroads? The optimistic answer begins with that unique bond. From the very beginning, Hosea was the only person Dutch treated as an equal, the only voice that could cut through his speeches about freedom and civilization. When Dutch dreamed too big, Hosea narrowed the target. When Dutch reached for dynamite, Hosea reached for a disguise. Valentine's auction scam, the roads manipulations, even the early plans around Blackwater all show a pattern. Dutch provided the fire, Hosea the flint and steel. Together, they made the gang the living embodiment of a story of loyalty and rebellion rather than simple banditry. In that light, Hosea's survival could have mattered. Imagine Dutch in the aftermath of Blackwater and Saint Denis with Hosea still at his side, not as a martyr, but as a constant, needling presence. Hosea would have mocked the Grand Tahiti delusions, pushed harder for a quiet escape to Australia or Canada, and refused to indulge Dutch's growing obsession with Micah's violent solutions. He had talked Dutch down before. Perhaps he could have slowed the spiral, softened the paranoia, bought the gang time to slip away before Beaver Hollow turned into a graveyard. Yet there is a darker, more pessimistic reading, one that fits the way the world was changing around them. By 1899, Dutch was already carrying the weight of Blackwater, Annabelle's death, and years of wounded pride. The old ways were dying, and every train line, every Pinkerton raid, every civilized street in Saint Denis felt to him like a personal insult. His philosophy had become less about freedom and more about being right. Even before the bank heist, Hosea's doubts are met with impatience, his caution brushed aside. The man who once listened now hears only challenges to his authority. Under that lens, Hosea's survival might have changed very little. Dutch was drifting beyond reach, a leader who needed adoration more than advice, a lost soul mistaking stubbornness for principle. Micah fed that need. Hosea threatened it. The most believable answer lies somewhere in between. Hosea may not have saved Dutch, or the gang as a whole, but he almost certainly would have recognized sooner that Dutch was no longer the man he rode with from its humble beginnings. He could have pushed Arthur and John to leave earlier, steered Abigail, Jack, and perhaps even Sadie toward safety. In the truest sense, Hosea's presence might have turned a massacre into a narrower escape, a total collapse into a fractured surviving family. In the end, the question remains open on purpose. Whether Hosea could have saved Dutch matters less than what the question reveals. How central Hosea was to the gang's fragile balance, how deep Dutch's flaws ran, and how tragic it is when a friendship that once promised a new world cannot survive the very civilization and chaos it helped provoke. Hosea's tragedy is not only personal, it is philosophical. From the very beginning, his creed is simple and ruthless in its clarity. Use the head before the gun, avoid blood when a word or a trick will do, and know when a battle is already lost. In a world obsessed with heroes who die on their feet, Hosea quietly insists that surviving to fight another day is the braver act. His philosophy is written in the gang's best moments. The Valentine auction scam, the Rhodes tobacco con, the careful manipulation of Braithwaites and Grays, these are not tales of blazing pistols, but of forged papers, false identities, and a calm voice that talks men into giving away their fortune. Hosea is in the truest sense a strategist of human weakness. Where others see a saloon, he sees leverage. Where others see a rich man, he sees a mark, a story, a pressure point. Yet the world around him worships a different legend. The mythology of the West celebrates the gunfighter, the last stand, the outlaw who refuses to bend. Songs are not written about the man who walks away, but the world was changing. The railroads carve steel lines through the wilderness, corporations buy land Dutch once promised to protect, and federal law arrives in the form of Pinkertons with warrants, telegraphs, and endless budgets. Against that machine, a single six-shooter is theater, not power. Hosea understands this. Dutch refuses to. Dutch clings to the image of the free outlaw, the living embodiment of resistance to civilization, a man whose will can bend history. Hosea, older and less enchanted, sees systems instead of symbols. Banks, rail companies, lawmakers, newspapers, institutions that remember, coordinate, and retaliate. He knows that every loud robbery writes another chapter in a story of inevitable federal revenge. In this sense, Hosea's outlook is strangely modern. He talks about leaving America altogether, about Tahiti or Australia, long before Dutch turns those places into desperate fantasies. To Hosea, those dreams are not delusions of endless freedom, but an early recognition that the old ways were dying and that survival means adaptation, compromise, perhaps even going legitimate. He would rather run a quiet business than die for a speech. The game's world itself validates him. The gangs that endure are those that bend, the families who ally with railroads, the criminals who launder their money into land, the outlaws who trade pistols for ledgers. Those who insist on remaining pure bandits, Colm O'Driscoll, Angelo Bronte's discarded thugs. The Van der Linde gang in its final form are crushed, scattered, or domesticated by the new order. Hosea sees this coming. That is his curse. He is a tragic realist, bound by loyalty to a man determined to live inside a dying legend. How long can a philosophy built on intelligence survive beside a partner addicted to spectacle? The answer, as the next stage of the gang's journey shows, is measured in bodies, betrayals, and one fateful city called Saint Denis. Saint Denis is the gang's great illusion, but the illusion began long before the city's lights. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang was already a miniature version of the country surrounding it, a story of freedom and family, of dreams and delusions, of men preaching justice while living by the gun. From the very beginning, Dutch and Hosea told themselves a comforting philosophy. They robbed the rich, the railroads, the banks that symbolized a rigged civilization. They took in the poor, the abandoned, the lost soul, wandering the edges of a hard world. On paper, it sounded almost noble. In practice, it meant feeding children with stolen money and justifying every corpse as a necessary step towards some hazy idea of liberty. Dutch became the living embodiment of that American self-image, eloquent, idealistic, always talking about freedom from government and corporate power. Hosea, by contrast, stood as the country's hidden conscience. He knew they were criminals. He knew the system was rotten. But he also knew that calling robbery rebellion did not wash the blood off anyone's hands. His cons in Valentine or the auction scam in Rhodes show this clearly. He aimed for tricks over bullets, control over chaos, but the end result was still exploitation. The gang's behavior mirrors the nation's contradictions. At times, they helped the oppressed, rescuing Sadie, defending the Wapiti from the worst excesses of the army, sheltering runaways and drifters. At other times, they become predators, shaking down towns, terrorizing roads, burning the Braithwaite estate, pushing people into conflicts they barely understand. How different is Dutch's rhetoric from the speeches of politicians who promise equality while building power on violence? Hosea is the one man inside that machine who sees the gears. Around the campfire, he tells Arthur that civilization is coming, that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying whether Dutch accepts it or not. He laughs at Dutch's talk of Tahiti, yet he is the first to suggest leaving America entirely. His recurring desire to walk away, to go to Australia or some quiet corner of the world, is a recognition that some systems cannot be fixed from within. Sometimes survival means stepping outside the story in the truest sense. That is Hosea's tragedy, and America's. He understands the hypocrisy, he understands the cost, but he cannot unmake the gang he helped found. His loyalty to Dutch chains him to a runaway train. When he dies in Saint Denis, it is not just a mentor falling, it is the last serious check on Dutch's delusions disappearing. What happens when a country, or a gang, loses the one voice brave enough to say no? The answer arrives in the chaos that follows, and in the man Hosea tried hardest to save, Arthur Morgan. In the aftermath of Saint Denis, the game does something subtle and devastating. It removes Hosea from the camp, and in that absence, the entire world of the Van der Linde gang feels colder, harsher, suddenly stripped of its last real warmth. The gang keeps moving, the outlaw life continues, but the center of gravity is gone. For many players, Hosea is first encountered not as a grand strategist or tragic figure, but as a presence. A warm, witty old man by the fire, a quiet voice offering Arthur coffee in the morning, or a dry comment when Dutch grows too theatrical. From its humble beginnings in Coulter's frozen misery to the gentler days at Clemens Point, Hosea becomes the living embodiment of the camp at peace, telling stories, playing dominoes, nudging people toward calmer choices without raising his voice. His best remembered moments are rarely the loudest. There is the fishing trip with Arthur and Jack, where the story pauses, guns holstered. to show Hosea in the truest sense as a grandfather figure, teaching patience rather than violence. There are the elegant cons in Valentine and Rhodes, where he sells a stolen horse with a smile, or works an auction crowd with almost theatrical charm, proving that brains can win where bullets would only make a mess. At night, he sits by the fire, spinning tales of past robberies, gently mocking Dutch's speeches, reminding everyone that this was once a story of cleverness, not carnage. That is why his death hits with such force. Hosea is not the loudest gun in a firefight, not the most present in every mission, yet he quietly represents the idea that there was another way for this family to live, a way based on planning instead of panic, on measured risk instead of delusions of grandeur. When he is executed on those Saint Denis steps, it is not only a man dying, it is the old philosophy of the gang being publicly, brutally discarded. The old ways were dying, and Dutch chooses to bury them with Hosea. Only later does the full tragedy sink in. After the credits, earlier scenes are re-examined, Hosea's doubts at Horseshoe Overlook, his insistence on leaving for Australia or Tahiti long before Dutch obsesses over those dreams, his weary attempts to steer the gang away from Blackwater-style disasters. Conversations that once sounded like mild bickering now play as a desperate man trying to save a lost soul he has known since the very beginning. In that light, Hosea becomes the emotional key to understanding Red Dead Redemption 2. This is not just a story about a mad leader dragging everyone into ruin. It is a story of a partnership broken, of a thinker silenced so a zealot can rule alone. Without Hosea, Dutch's fall seems inevitable. With Hosea remembered, it becomes something far worse, a choice. And that choice will haunt Arthur and the world he leaves behind long after the guns fall silent. Hosea's death leaves a silence, but his voice does not disappear. It lingers in the minds of those he raised, turning the end of the van der Linde dream into something more than blind collapse. It becomes a reckoning. For Arthur, Hosea is the first real teacher. From the very beginning, Dutch gives Arthur a philosophy, a story about freedom and civilization, about fighting a rigged world. Hosea gives him something quieter and far more dangerous, the habit of thinking. Hosea teaches Arthur to read, to plan, to watch people, to see angles instead of just targets. Valentine cons, road schemes, the auction scam with the horse, these are classrooms as much as crimes. When Arthur later turns those same tools inward, questioning Dutch, questioning the gang, that is Hosea speaking through him. The old conman's legacy is the voice in Arthur's head that asks, again and again, does this still make sense? That is why Arthur's final days feel, in the truest sense, like a story of inheritance. Dying from tuberculosis, watching Dutch slide into delusions and cruelty, Arthur uses Hosea's lessons against the very family that gave them. He weighs risk, he studies men, he reads the world as it really is, rather than as Dutch imagines it. And with that clarity, he chooses to save John, to protect Abigail and Jack, to betray an old ideal in order to honor a deeper loyalty Hosea always hinted at, that family is not just who shares the campfire, but who deserves a future. John, too, carries Hosea's imprint. From its humble beginnings, the gang sells him a dream of outlaw freedom, but Hosea is the one who quietly questions whether that dream can last. Around campfires and on long rides, Hosea urges John to think about Abigail, to think about Jack, to stop vanishing for months on reckless sprees. Long before John walks away at Beaver Hollow, Hosea has already planted the seed that a man can leave, that a man should leave, if staying means sacrificing his child to a doomed cause. When John later becomes a rancher, trying and failing and trying again to live honest, that struggle traces back to Hosea's insistence that there is a world beyond Dutch. Without Hosea, the gang's weaknesses stop being manageable and become fatal. He had been the planner, the mediator, the moral boundary. He was the one who told Dutch no, who steered them toward brains instead of bullets, who turned Dutch's wild speeches into workable schemes. Once Saint Denis takes him, Dutch's worst impulses run unchecked. Plans grow grander and thinner, paranoia replaces patience, Micah's poison fills the space where Hosea's counsel once sat. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and the only man willing to truly adapt is gone. Hosea's legacy is double-edged. He helps build the gang that robs, kills, and leaves a trail of grief across the American West. He is the living embodiment of the charming outlaw who thinks he can outplay civilization forever. Yet he also gives Arthur and John the conscience and courage to try to break that cycle. The end of the van der Linde dream is not just Dutch falling from a cliff of his own making. It is the collapse of a shared vision born in a boarding house, between two men trying to rob each other and instead inventing a life. That dream cannot survive a world they refuse to fully understand. But in the broken pieces Hosea leaves behind, something new begins. A man on a mountain choosing mercy, and another on a ranch trying to be more than a lost soul with a gun. Hosea's life, in the truest sense, is the spine of this entire saga. From its humble beginnings in a shabby boarding house to a gunshot on the marble steps of a St. Denis bank, his journey traces the arc from laughter to ruin, from shared dreams to shattered delusions. From the very beginning, his story is a story of irony. A drifting conman with a hazy past, Hosea Matthews survives not by the gun, but by the tongue, charming and cheating his way across a world that never gave him much. Then, in a cramped room in the 1870s, he meets Dutch van der Linde when both men try to rob each other and end up laughing instead. That failed robbery becomes a partnership, that partnership becomes a philosophy, and that philosophy becomes a gang. Together they gather lost souls and build something that feels bigger than crime. Arthur comes first, a tough, angry boy Dutch teaches to think, and Hosea teaches to see. John follows, another stray who becomes a son in all but name. Around them, the van der Linde gang grows into a wandering family, robbing railroads and stagecoaches, preaching freedom and loyalty while camping on the edges of a civilization they claim to despise. For a time, Hosea is the living embodiment of their balance. Brains to Dutch's fire, caution to his recklessness. Yet even then, the world was changing. The old ways were dying, replaced by banks, corporations, and the slow, relentless march of law in tailored suits. Hosea feels it first. At Coulter, at Valentine, in the doomed games played in Rhodes, he keeps pushing for quieter scores, for exits that do not end in blood. He suggests Australia or some distant shore, long before Dutch turns Tahiti into a fever dream. He sees that their frontier is not a place on a map, but a shrinking space in history. When Blackwater explodes and the gang begins its last desperate migration, Hosea becomes more than strategist, he becomes conscience. He argues against Dutch's alliances, questions Micah's influence, and tries to pull Arthur back from blind faith. The tension is always the same. Idealism versus reality, freedom versus civilization, loyalty versus betrayal. How long can an outlaw family survive when its own leader refuses to admit the tide has turned? The answer comes in St. Denis. The man who prefers cons to gunfights dies in a public execution, held helpless in front of a bank vault while Pinkertons and policemen turn philosophy into gunsmoke. It is the cruelest irony. Hosea, who always feared cities and institutions, is murdered by both in a single instant. His death is not just a personal tragedy, it is America's. A story of people convinced they can outrun history, gunned down on the steps of modernity, because they will not let go of their myths. And that is why Hosea lingers. His life becomes a lens for the entire Red Dead Redemption world, explaining why its sunsets feel so beautiful and so haunted. If this is what happens to the wisest man in the gang, what hope is there for anyone else? In the next part, that question moves from Hosea's ghost to the survivors who must live with his absence. Hosea's ghost lingers, but a haunting presence always raises a harder question. If his life is a lens, then who stands at the center of this story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and scattered on the wind? Is the true heart of this saga Hosea, Arthur, or John? For some, Arthur is the answer, in the truest sense. His journey from trusted enforcer to dying penitent feels like the living embodiment of the whole Red Dead Redemption world, a man crushed between freedom and civilization, between the old ways and the new order. Others point to John, the survivor dragged into the next chapter, forced to carry the consequences into Beecher's hope and beyond. Yet for many, the center quietly belongs to Hosea, the first voice of reason, the man who saw the end coming from its humble beginnings. Memory complicates that choice. During a first playthrough, Hosea's presence can seem gentle, even background, compared with Dutch's speeches and Arthur's gunfights. Did those early warnings in Valentine and Rhodes truly register? The way he questions the Blackwater disaster, The way he urges Dutch to walk away from Saint Denis before the bank job. The way he suggests leaving America altogether long before Tahiti becomes a desperate fantasy. Or did the full weight of his importance only land once the gang lay in ruins and his absence was felt in every reckless plan that followed? Every player carries a different answer, anchored to specific moments. Perhaps it is a campfire story about conning a man in a hotel, told with that weary charm that makes the outlaw world feel almost domestic for a heartbeat. Perhaps it is a quiet bit of advice to Arthur, reminding him that the world was changing and that killing for Dutch's philosophy would not stop it. Perhaps it is a Valentine con gone right, a road scheme that relies on wit instead of blood, proving that Hosea's way still worked even as the old ways were dying. Those memories feed the what-if questions that refuse to die. Could Hosea have saved Dutch if he had survived Saint Denis? If the gang had truly listened after Blackwater and slipped away to Australia or some nameless shore? Would Dutch's paranoia have faded or only found new enemies? At what precise moment did the dream become impossible to salvage? When Dutch ignored Hosea's counsel, when Arthur's doubts hardened, or when John chose his family over the gang's illusions? In the end, these are not just plot points on a timeline. They are fragments of a meditation on loyalty and regret, on the cost of clinging to a dying way of life. The heart of the saga may wear Hosea's face, Arthur's scars, or John's tired eyes, but each answer reveals something about the person who chooses it. And in the next part, that choice will echo through those who outlived the gang and tried, against all odds, to build something new from its ashes. So the ledger closes on Hosea Matthews, not with a gunshot in a bank or a speech on a gallows, but with an understanding. From its humble beginnings in that shabby boarding house to the smoke and chaos of Saint Denis, this has been his complete arc as it can be traced through scattered memories, half-told anecdotes, and the long shadow he leaves behind. From the very beginning, Hosea was the hidden architect of the Linde gang, the quiet hand behind the grand philosophy. Dutch stood on the hill and shouted about freedom, civilization, and resistance. Hosea stood beside him and made sure there was food, an exit route, and a story to sell the next mark. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in desperation and undone by pride. When that quiet hand was removed, the whole structure began to shake. The gang has always been more than a collection of outlaws. It is a microcosm of a world in transition, struggling between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization. In the truest sense, Hosea is the living embodiment of that struggle. He knows the world was changing. He knows the old ways were dying. He tries to bend with it, to steer Dutch toward Tahiti, Australia, anywhere that might keep the dream alive without drowning it in blood. Dutch refuses to bend, and so he breaks. Understanding Hosea means understanding why this entire saga hurts as much as it does. His doubts in camp, his preference for cons over massacres in Valentine and Rhodes, his warnings before Blackwater and Saint Denis, all of it forms the emotional logic of Red Dead Redemption's world. This is not just the fall of one man or one gang. It is a meditation on what happens when an idealistic philosophy outlives its time and refuses to admit it. Hosea leaves no monuments, no statue in Saint Denis, no wanted poster curling on a sheriff's wall. Yet his legacy runs through Arthur's final ride into the storm, through John hammering fence posts at Beecher's Hope, through the way players still argue over Dutch's intentions years after the credits roll. Every time Arthur questions Dutch, Hosea speaks. Every time John chooses his son over the gun, Hosea wins an argument he never got to finish. So where does the story ride next? Whose complete tale should be laid out from its humble beginnings to its bitter end? Dutch, the fallen prophet? Arthur, the penitent outlaw? John, the reluctant heir? Or a more unexpected choice hiding at the campfire's edge? The next deep dive is already saddling up, and the only question is whose shadow will be followed across this dying frontier. It all began with a pattern interrupt. Two men trying to rob each other in a cheap room, hands on pistols, nerves on edge. Then a pause. Then laughter. An old conman and a young idealist, sharing a bottle they had both planned to steal. Unaware they had just ignited a story that would echo through an entire generation of outlaws, long after the last campfire burned out.